Imagine this, friends, a tale of silk roads and swirling rumors of a young man who became a legend. Stay close now, because this story begins with a secret whispered in the Venetian night and ends in a court where gold and ambition knew no end. Before you even think of clicking away, know this: tonight's story will carry you across deserts, over mountains, and deep into the heart of an empire few had ever seen. So grab your drink, lean in, and let's journey together. Tonight, under the flickering light of candles and the creak of wooden floors, we uncover the life and wanderings of a man named Matteo Perlo, not Marco Polo, but a merchant's son born in the shadow of great ships and even greater dreams. In the 13th century, Venice was a kingdom of canals, salt air, and scheming minds. Here, Matteo was born into a family of traders who thought nothing of sending their sons beyond the horizon, where fortunes and fates were made. But while his father, Donato Perlo, was far away in the rugged lands of the East, Matteo grew up among ledgers and quiet sighs of longing. His mother, Rosa, would hum old songs as she counted the silver that crossed her palm, each note filled with the scent of cinnamon and faraway seas. Every evening, when the sun dipped behind the domes of Venice, Matteo would listen to his uncle's tales, not bedtime stories, but half-forgotten whispers of strange cities and even stranger customs. He learned of distant cities with walls of gold, of the endless plains beyond the Black Sea, and of merchants who vanished chasing the promise of silk. These were not mere fables to Matteo. They were challenges, invitations to a world that trembled just beyond his reach. When Donato finally returned in the year 1268, he was a man, changed skin, burned by desert sun, eyes sharpened by the weight of secrets. And he did not come alone. At his side was an old friend, Alonso the Wise, whose mind was as quick as the wind over the Caspian Sea. Their arrival was more than a homecoming. It was a message wrapped in parchment, bearing the seal of a ruler whose power could not be measured in mere coins. Kublai Khan, sovereign of 1,000 tribes and dreams. Kublai had asked not just for trade, but for trust. He wanted a voice from the Latin lands, a bridge to a world that was, to him, as distant as the moon. And so, with a spark of daring and more than a little curiosity, young Matteo, now 17, and with eyes that saw more than most, was chosen. Not because he was a soldier or a noble, but because he could read between silences and see beyond walls. Their journey began in the hush of early morning, when the mists clung to the canals of Venice like old secrets. The trio, Matteo, Donato, and Alonso, set out not in a grand parade, but in quiet resolve. With them, they carried letters of promise and the weight of both faith and ambition. The road ahead was a tapestry of wonder and peril, through the Holy Land where prayers mingled with the clink of coins, across the harsh lands of Armenia where stone towers watched with ancient eyes, and into the Empire of Persia, where caravans whispered in the wind. Nights were spent under stars that blinked like ancient watchmen. The scent of smoke and foreign spices filled Matteo's mind, each breath a lesson in a world he'd only glimpsed in stories. He learned quickly the dialects of merchants in bustling bazaars, the sly smiles of traders who measured every word like gold. Alonso taught him how to read a man's eyes, while Donato shared tales of the East that were equal parts truth and myth. Some days they were welcomed by lords in distant courts, where velvet cushions and sweet wine hid the steel in every gaze. Other nights they crept through villages that lay silent under the weight of plague or war, where only dogs roamed the empty streets. In the deserts of Persia, they nearly turned back. The Khan's power had shifted with the death of a distant ruler, and the roads were haunted by bandits, and worse, the echoes of old vengeance that turned brother against brother. But Matteo, who had known the ache of distance all his life, refused to falter. Where others saw only danger, he saw the flicker of new maps in his mind. They reached the kingdom of Badakhshan, a place of icy winds and craggy peaks, where Matteo fell ill. For months, he lay beneath thick firs, while the snow whispered at the windows. Alonso spoke of the constellations, and how every star was a promise waiting to be claimed. Donato paced the floor, plotting a path through valleys that were little more than rumor. When Matteo rose again, he was no longer merely a merchant's son. The fever had burned away his boyhood, leaving behind a mind as sharp as a dagger and a heart ready to embrace the unknown. Their next steps carried them past ancient watchtowers, where hawks circled above like silent guardians, and into mountain passes so narrow that only one could walk at a time. Every footstep echoed against stone, every breath tasted of snow and hope. In one village, Matteo met a musician named Layla, who played a flute made of bone. Her music was as haunting as the winds that swept through the valleys, and for one night, they danced in the glow of a fire that painted the snow red. In every market, and every quiet night by the fire, Matteo took notes not just of trade goods and coin values, but of stories, of mothers who wept for sons lost in the wars of emperors, of children who chased dreams in the dust of caravans. His mind became a living map, a tapestry of faces and places that few in Venice would ever see. By the time they approached the lands of Kublai Khan, Matteo no longer needed to rely on the stories of others. His own feet had written their own path across the silk and dust of Asia. And when at last they stood before the Khan's court, a palace of white marble and shimmering silk, where every step was watched by 100 silent eyes, Matteo understood that he was no longer the boy who had stared at the horizon from his mother's window. He was a bridge now, woven of all he had seen and all he still yearned to know. And so, friends, as we gather here tonight, let the name of Matteo Perlo remind us of the power of curiosity and the endless roads it can uncover. If you're feeling the thrill of these ancient footsteps, tap that like button, share this story, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. There's always another horizon waiting. Stay with us on Stunning Story, and we'll see what legends await next. Imagine stepping into a world so vast it seemed to swallow the sky, a place where snow still clung to mountain peaks in the middle of summer, and the wind carried the scent of ancient cities long forgotten by time. This, my friends, is the story of Matteo Perlo, the Venetian merchant's son who journeyed farther than any map could dream, a tale of determination, mystery, and the restless pull of the unknown. They began their trek through the towering peaks of the Pamir Mountains, where even the summer sun couldn't melt the snow that crusted the jagged rocks like stubborn memories. Each step was a battle against biting winds and the thin air that scraped their lungs raw. But Matteo and his companions pressed on, driven not by gold, but by the promises of discovery and the whispers of a ruler whose name echoed like thunder in the halls of every trading post. Past those icy cliffs lay the Goru Desert, a merciless wasteland of shifting sands and shimmering illusions. Here, the earth itself seemed to play tricks on the mind. In the heat of midday, Matteo swore he saw rivers of silver that vanished when he drew near, and mountains of glass that turned to dust when he blinked. Sandstorms rose up like ghosts, ready to swallow a man whole. Every drop of water was worth more than gold, and every night spent huddled against the cold stars felt like a prayer for survival. And yet they endured. For 3.5 long years, Matteo, his father Donato, and the wise old Alonso journeyed deeper into lands most Venetians had only heard about in half-believed tales. It was sometime around 1276 when they finally arrived at the gates of the grandest empire the world had ever known, the empire of Kublai Khan, a realm that stretched farther than any merchant's dream. Matteo, the boy from the canals of Venice, now stood on the threshold of a world no one back home could have truly imagined. As he entered the Khan's court in what is today northern China, it must have felt like stepping through a door in the fabric of the earth itself. Marble walls and golden roofs gleamed in the sun, and every corner of the palace was alive with color and the hum of distant tongues. Kublai Khan, grandson of the fearsome Genghis, was no mere conqueror. He was a builder, a thinker, a man obsessed with learning the secrets of every land he ruled. His empire was a patchwork quilt, stitched from the threads of dozens of cultures, from the shimmering coasts of the Pacific to the smoky hearths of Eastern Europe. And in the middle of this swirling tapestry stood Matteo, a young foreigner whose quick mind and sharp eyes soon caught the Khan's attention. The Khan saw in Matteo something more than just another guest. Here was a mind unshackled by the limits of his homeland, a soul hungry for knowledge, not power. Matteo spoke carefully, choosing his words like a craftsman choosing the finest silk. He watched and listened, absorbing the customs of the Mongol court, the ebb and flow of languages that rose and fell like the tides. Within months, the Khan's trust in this curious Venetian grew. Matteo was no longer a visitor. He became an emissary of the Mongol court, a witness to its wonders and an envoy to its distant edges. Kublai Khan tasked him with missions that would have broken lesser men, journeys across deserts where the sun burned the skin to leather, and through jungles where every step was a gamble against snakes and spirits. Matteo traveled into lands that no European had ever recorded. In the humid forests of Burma, he watched elephants weave through bamboo like silent ships. In the high valleys of Tibet, he learned the songs of mountain monks who spoke of balance and breath. These were not idle travels. The Khan wanted to know everything: the state of roads and harvests, the quiet whispers of discontent that sometimes rose in distant towns. Matteo, with his keen eye for detail, became the empire's wandering eyes. He saw things that would have seemed like fantasy to his kin in Venice: paper money used like gold, bridges that stretched across rivers like lace, and lamps that lit whole cities with a glow that never dimmed. He watched the Mongol couriers race across the steppe on fresh horses, faster than any message could travel in the West. He marveled at the Khan's libraries, filled with books and scrolls from every corner of the earth, proof that knowledge was the true treasure of any empire. But Matteo also saw the other side of the Khan's vast realm, the shadows that clung to its greatness. In bustling markets, he watched as peasants were driven to the edge of ruin by taxes meant to feed the empire's endless hunger. In quiet courtyards, he witnessed punishments that turned his stomach: thieves bound and displayed as warnings, entire villages uprooted and moved at the emperor's whim. The same hand that built marble halls could sweep them away like dust. Even so, Matteo's curiosity never dimmed. With every new province he entered, he found another puzzle piece to fit into the growing map of his mind. In the mountain kingdom of Yunshan, he discovered forests where the trees smelled of cinnamon and the ground glittered with flakes of salt that turned pink in the evening sun. In the markets of the western oasis, he traded stories with merchants who claimed to have seen the edge of the world itself. And in every city, from the bustling crossroads of Kashgar to the labyrinthine streets of Jiandu, Matteo wrote invisible notes in his heart. He learned the names of governors who ruled with an iron fist and those who ruled with an open palm. He listened to the prayers that rose from Buddhist temples, to the songs of Muslim muezzins, and to the quiet counsel of Confucian scholars. In this empire, Matteo saw how belief and order could coexist in ways that his fellow Venetians could barely comprehend. The deeper he traveled, the more he became a part of this empire. Matteo was no longer just a guest in Kublai Khan's court. He was a trusted voice, a bridge between East and West. And with each passing season, the idea of returning home grew dimmer in his mind. Venice became a memory wrapped in the sound of water lapping against stone, while the Mongol Empire became his waking reality. Matteo's journeys took him into realms that lived only in the dreams of those who had never left their shores. He rode through plains so wide they swallowed the horizon, and along rivers the color of green jade, where fishermen sang songs older than any church bell. In lands of snow leopards and burning sands, he learned that the world was larger and stranger than any book could hold. In the south, Matteo visited cities carved into cliffs that seemed to touch the sky itself. Here, the air was thin and sweet, and the markets were filled with traders whose tongues wove together stories of the stars. In these high cities, he saw not just goods, but ideas traded like precious gems, philosophies carried on the breath of travelers who had crossed mountains for the chance to speak with a stranger. He saw wonders that no one back home could have believed, fireworks that split the night sky like fallen stars, not merely for celebration, but for war, to blind and terrify enemies. He watched engineers build canals that turned deserts into fields of green, and he saw couriers carrying the Khan's word on wooden tablets that glowed with the power of the imperial seal. But for every marvel, there was a shadow. Matteo saw whole communities forced from their homes to build palaces they would never live in. He watched as taxes broke the backs of farmers, and as the threat of the Khan's justice kept even the proudest warlords silent. He learned that in an empire built on conquest, peace was a delicate dance, a performance that could vanish in a single breath. Still, Matteo's eyes never closed to the wonder of it all. In the tapestries of this world, he saw the threads of a story that stretched back to the dawn of empires and forward to a future no one could see clearly. And in every quiet moment under starlight, beside a fire, or in the hush of a dawn that tasted of salt and possibility, he carried the same question. How could he ever return to the narrow alleys of Venice after breathing the wild air of a world so vast? As Matteo Perlo rode on, the roads ahead promised more than silk or gold. They promised the chance to become a living legend, a bridge not just of trade, but of understanding. And if you've felt even a spark of wonder hearing his tale tonight, don't forget to like this video, share it, and let us know where you're watching from. Because here on Stunning Story, the next journey is always waiting just over the horizon. Can you imagine holding the power to see an empire as no one else ever would? To stand in the heart of a world where rivers ran with salt and gold, where no single god or race claimed dominion, and where fear and wonder wove the threads of a kingdom that touched the sky. Tonight, I'll take you deeper still, into the soul of Matteo Perlo's journey, the Venetian boy who became a man of two worlds, torn between the glimmer of distant shores and the weight of memory. It wasn't just the staggering scale of Kublai Khan's empire that left Matteo breathless. It was the wild patchwork of beliefs, tongues, and skin tones that lived within it. No single prayer rose above another. No single bloodline commanded the seas of warriors, merchants, and mystics who flowed through this empire's beating heart. It was an empire stitched together by terror and wonder, a fragile tapestry of ambition that seemed to shimmer beneath the stars. Matteo took it all in with the hunger of a boy who'd grown up hearing only half-told tales in his uncle's shop. Now, he didn't just pass through cities, he walked through living worlds, each one more dazzling and daunting than the last. And as the years slipped by like the silken rivers of the East, Matteo found himself no longer a stranger. He was a known face in the gilded halls of Kublai Khan's court, a trusted ear in a kingdom that prized whispers and secrets above all. He had become more than an observer. He was now a familiar figure, draped in the fine silks of the East, fluent in dialects that once sounded like songs of the wind. And he was trusted in ways that few Westerners could ever hope to be trusted by a ruler whose empire spanned the mountains of Tibet to the jungles of Burma. Kublai Khan had come to rely on Matteo not merely as a messenger, but as a living witness to his dreams. Matteo's Venetian roots, once a distant curiosity, became his strength. He owed no loyalties to the tribes or factions that nipped at the empire's edges. His eyes were clear, his heart unbound by family feuds or clan debts. The Khan sent him far and wide. Matteo was tasked with more than carrying letters. He was dispatched to weigh the taxes of distant provinces, to measure the flicker of dissent among governors, and to watch the slow grinding of commerce that fed the empire's insatiable appetite. His Western heritage made him a fascination to some, a curiosity to others. In markets thick with incense and chatter, people would stop and stare at the pale-skinned visitor, who spoke their language as if he'd been born beneath their moon. But Matteo never wore arrogance like a crown. He listened, he learned, and he watched, always watched for the quiet stories behind the loud ones. He remembered how fishermen in a river town sent out cormorants, black as night, to hunt fish for their masters. He recalled the scent of cedar and musk that filled the temples where monks recited sutras gilded in gold. In every report he carried back to the Khan, Matteo didn't just recount facts. He wove them into living tapestries, bright and rich, each detail a stroke of a brush that painted the empire's soul. Sometimes he found himself in places even Mongol princes feared to tread, shrines at the edge of the known world. watched over by stone lions and silent priests, mountain paths where only the wind dared speak, valleys where rebels whispered of freedom in the hush of night. Mateo's curiosity was his armor. Where others saw only peril, he saw the chance to learn. He watched the court of Kublai Khan as it danced through seasons of splendor and shadow. He saw musicians in silk masks, their songs rippling through incense-choked air, and he watched as dancers twirled beneath the cold eyes of generals and priests. He witnessed the Khan receive tributes of pearls that glowed like moons, of ivory carved with stories older than any scribe's memory, and of lions from lands so far away they were spoken of as legends. The court was a crossroads of the world, a place where dreams and intrigues collided. Merchants from Africa, mystics from India, warriors from the steppes all gathered here, drawn to the flicker of power that burned in Kublai's gaze. Mateo was no longer just a witness. He was a trusted thread in the grand design, the rare outsider who'd been allowed to slip through the silk screens and see the empire's true face. Yet even as the years folded into one another like the pages of a prayer scroll, the thought of Venice began to echo in Mateo's heart. It came to him in quiet moments, like a candle flickering in the dark. He would think of the salt-streaked air of his childhood, the way the light danced on water in the canals, and the sound of bells that rose above the chatter of markets. He had arrived in this empire as a boy with eyes full of wonder. Now he was a man in his 30s, shaped by the East but pulled by the memory of the West. Mateo began to ask himself the question that had haunted wanderers for centuries. How long can a guest remain before he forgets the way home? Could he still speak in the old Venetian tongue with the ease of a boy who'd grown up counting the chimes of St. Mark's bell? Or had the rhythms of Asia woven themselves so deeply into his bones that he would forever be a stranger in the land of his birth? The chance to answer that question finally came in the early 1290s. Kublai Khan, who had ruled with both iron and wisdom, was growing old. His hair turned silver, and the empire that had once seemed eternal began to crack like ice on a winter lake. Whispers of betrayal crept through the marble halls. Factions rose behind silk screens, each one a shadow waiting for the old lion to close his eyes. The Khan, reluctant to lose his most loyal outsider, delayed Mateo's departure again and again, but fate had its own plans. A Mongol princess was to be wed to a prince of Persia, a fragile alliance that would bind two mighty worlds together. The roads of the steppe were too perilous, so Kublai Khan ordered that she be escorted by sea, and he chose Mateo and his companions for this most delicate mission. The decision was both a blessing and a curse. For Mateo, the chance to return home came not in the quiet of retirement, but in the roar of one last journey, a journey by sea, across waters that had claimed the lives of many bolder than he. Their fleet set sail under the bright sun, decks crowded with Persian dignitaries and Mongol guards. They slipped down the southern coast of China, past jungles alive with the cries of birds Mateo had never seen, and into the open expanse of the Indian Ocean. But the sea was no friend. Storms rose from the depths, tearing sails and snapping masts like twigs. Disease swept through the crowded holds like a silent thief, stealing breath and hope alike. By the time the battered ships reached the shores of Persia, the princess's groom lay dead, a cruel twist of fate that turned celebration into mourning. Mateo watched the waves crash against the hull of the ship, and he thought of the lives lost to the ocean's hunger, and yet he survived. He always survived, as if the world itself had decided his story was not yet finished. From Persia, Mateo's road turned once more to the land. He crossed the rugged lands of Armenia, where fortress walls still bore the scars of 1,000 wars. He passed through Anatolia, where the markets smelled of roasted lamb and honey, and where every sunrise painted the stones red. Each step carried him closer to the Mediterranean world, to the familiar pulse of traders and the songs of minstrels that tasted of home. For Mateo, the journey had been more than a passage of distance. It had been a journey of the soul, from a boy in Venice to a man who had walked with emperors, dined with mystics, and seen the world's true heart. So, friends, let Mateo Perlo's story remind us that no matter how far we roam, the memory of home will always call to us, a whisper in the dark. a promise in the quiet. If you felt the weight of Matteo's footsteps tonight, don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow travelers, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Because on Stunning Story, there's always another chapter waiting to be told and another horizon waiting to be crossed. Picture this. You're a traveler who has touched the edges of the known world, who has dined with emperors and seen lands so foreign they feel like fever dreams. You return home after decades, only to find that your city no longer recognizes you. Your clothes are strange. Your words carry a foreign lilt. The tales you bring back sound like the ramblings of a man lost in a dream. This was the final journey of Matteo Pirlo, a journey not just across oceans and deserts, but across the shifting sands of memory and belonging. It had been 2 long decades since Matteo and his family had left the salt-kissed canals of Venice behind. When they returned, Venice was no longer the city he remembered. War had erupted with Genoa, and the familiar alleys now echoed with the clatter of soldiers' boots. Suspicion clung to every corner. Strangers wore the faces of old friends, and the markets that once smelled of roasted chestnuts and wine were now filled with the cold bite of fear. The Pirlos stepped ashore not as returning heroes, but as foreigners in their own land. Their fine robes of brocade and silk, once treasures of the East, were met with curious stares and muttered suspicions. Their voices carried the cadence of distant lands. Matteo's accent was now a mixture of Mongol commands and Persian lullabies. Even the way he walked was different, shoulders squared from years of riding the high mountain passes and endless plains. Venice had moved on without them. The quiet corners where Matteo once played as a child were now filled with the watchful eyes of soldiers and the soft rattle of merchants counting coin in hushed tones. But Matteo didn't shrink. His heart still beat with the rhythm of distant gongs and the hush of desert winds, and he carried with him something no border could stop: stories. One last mission burned in his chest, even as the familiar streets seemed to push him away. He had to write it all down: every grain of sand, every snow-capped mountain, every shimmering court where the fate of nations was decided over cups of spiced tea. Matteo had spent half a lifetime gathering these stories, and he would not let them vanish like footprints in a storm. Yet even as he gathered ink and parchment, fate swept him up once more. Venice's war with Genoa called every able-bodied man to arms. Matteo, who had survived deserts, dynasties, and the delicate intrigues of the Mongol court, was now pressed into a new conflict, one not of trade routes and diplomacy, but of clashing steel and salt-slick decks. He found himself on the deck of a Venetian galley off the coast of Anatolia, the sea churning black beneath a sky of iron. Cannons roared, and the scent of salt and blood mingled in the air. Matteo's hands, more used to holding scrolls than swords, gripped the rail as Genoese ships closed in. He had walked through the halls of emperors, and now he fought for survival in a battle that seemed to have no end. Captured in 1298, Matteo was dragged from the blood-slicked decks and thrown into a Genoese prison. The cell was little more than a hole in the earth, cold, damp, and lit by a single flickering torch that cast shadows like ghosts on the walls. The stone was slick with moss, and the air stank of sweat and mold. Yet in that darkness, Matteo's greatest journey began. For in that cell, he met a man named Lorenzo di Parma, a writer of romances and epic ballads whose quill had long been stilled by the weight of chains. Matteo, with nothing but time and memories to keep him warm, began to speak. Night after night, he poured out the wonders he had seen. The paper money of the Khan cities that changed hands like dreams, the great snow leopards that stalked the high peaks, the black stones that burned like firewood in the hearths of Asia's lords. Lorenzo listened, his eyes wide in the dim light. He scratched lines into scraps of parchment, piecing together Matteo's words like a mosaic of wonder. The tales of the Silk Road and Kublai Khan's court spilled out. Cities that glowed brighter than any in Christendom, armies that moved with the precision of a single mind, rituals so foreign they seemed spun from the threads of legend. It was more than a travelogue. It was a revelation. Matteo's words were like sparks in the dark, each one a promise of a world beyond the walls of that prison cell. Lorenzo's quill danced to keep up, weaving the stories into a manuscript that would outlive them both. That manuscript, eventually called The Wonders of Matteo Perlo, though history would remember it, under other names spread like wildfire. Though few could read in those days, the tales were carried on the breath of merchants in smoky taverns, whispered by sailors who traced Matteo's journeys on the salt-streaked decks of their ships. Some called it a treasure map in disguise, believing that hidden in Matteo's words were the keys to fabled cities of gold. Others scoffed, claiming it was nothing more than the fever dream of a man too long lost to the east. How could a Venetian have seen palaces of marble in lands ruled by Mongol princes? How could he describe creatures no one in Europe had seen, cities that dwarfed Rome, and customs that turned the old laws of Christendom on their head? But Matteo never flinched. Even in his final days, when friends and doubters pressed him to admit he had spun these tales from moonlight and longing, he refused. "I did not tell half of what I saw," he is said to have whispered, his voice steady as the tide. The book became many things: a guide for merchants hungry for spice and silk, a hymn to the idea of lands beyond the maps, and for some, a window into a world that shimmered just beyond the horizon of reason. To those who still clung to the old certainties of Europe, Matteo's words blurred the line between myth and truth. But they planted a seed of curiosity, that would bloom in the hearts of dreamers and conquerors alike. Matteo eventually walked free from that prison cell, his body weary but his spirit unbroken. He returned to Venice, to the narrow canals that wound like blue veins through the city of his birth. But he was no longer the boy who had left with a head full of rumors and a heart hungry for adventure. He was a man who had held the world in his hands, who had looked into the eyes of emperors and seen both kindness and cruelty reflected back. Venice had changed, and so had Matteo. No longer a stranger, no longer doubted by all. The tales of Matteo Perlo had captured the imagination of a continent. Kings in cold castles spoke of Cath, the name he used for China, as if it were a spell to ward off the dark. Merchants in smoky halls debated the worth of his descriptions, of golden palaces, of armies that moved like rivers of steel, of spices that could turn a meal to magic or preserve the dead for centuries. For most in the West, his stories were the first true window into a world they could barely comprehend. They spoke of paper money, an idea that seemed like alchemy to the merchants of Europe, of courier systems that made Europe's look like a child's game, of cities that rose from the plains, like dreams given stone and breath. He did not return to wealth or power. He did not claim a throne or a crown. Matteo slipped back into the quiet rhythm of a merchant's life, dignified, measured, the memories of Asia's wonders a constant echo in his thoughts. He spent his days trading spices and silks, living in the city whose stones he still called home. But his influence rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined. One of the minds that would be touched by Matteo's words belonged to a young sailor from Genoa, centuries later a man named Cristoforo Colombo. Colombo read Matteo's tales with a feverish light in his eyes, scribbling notes in the margins, dreaming of reaching the east by sailing west into the unknown. In the quiet nights of his own voyages, Colombo carried Matteo's stories with him like a map of possibility. Matteo Perlo had not conquered lands, but he had conquered the boundaries of imagination. In the woven words of his tales, he gave Europe a reason to look beyond the fog of its own fears, to believe that the world was bigger, stranger, and more wondrous than they had ever dared to dream. If tonight's tale of Matteo Perlo has sparked even a flicker of that ancient curiosity in you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow wanderers, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Here at Stunning Story, the journey never ends, and the horizon is always just beyond the next tale. Think about this. In the end, it wasn't the steps Matteo Perlo took that truly changed the world. It was the stories he shared, the horizons he stretched for those who had never left the safety of home. As he lay dying, his bones weary from the weight of distant lands, the city of Venice slept around him. The canals lapped against the stones of his youth, and the moon cast pale reflections over water that had carried countless dreams. Matteo Perlo lived to see 69 winters, breathing his last in 1,324, not in some distant caravanserai or the echoing halls of a Mongol palace, but in the city where his journey had first begun. The boy who had once run barefoot through Venice's alleys returned to them one final time, his body finally at rest but his spirit still yearning for the road. When the city's bells tolled for Matteo's passing, they rang for more than a merchant. They rang for a bridge between worlds, a man who had touched the edge of every map and found a way to bring back pieces of the world for those too afraid to go. His coffin was carried through the streets of Venice, past markets that smelled of salt and the sweet sting of wine, past churches whose domes watched over the city like patient gods. He was laid to rest in the quiet earth of home, a final resting place, only steps from the waters that had whispered of far-off lands when he was a boy. But even in death, Matteo's story was far from over. His will was more than a simple list of belongings. It was a testament to a life lived beyond the borders of the known. Silks that shimmered with the colors of Asian skies, jade that gleamed like the eyes of the East, vessels of perfume and oil that had once graced the courts of Mongol princes. Each artifact was a quiet proof that what he spoke of was not just the stuff of fireside tales. Matteo left more than objects. He left instructions for donations to the poor, a final act of kindness that echoed the bridges he had built in life. And he freed a servant, a man of the Tatar lands who had journeyed with him across deserts and snow. In that single act, Matteo honored the truth that had guided him through the harshest roads, that every soul, no matter how humble, was a world of wonder waiting to be known. Yet, even as Matteo's life flickered out, doubts clung to his name like mist on the lagoon. His stories were too vast, too incredible. How could one man stand in the courts of emperors, hear the songs of distant jungles, and see rivers that shone green as jade? To some, Matteo's voice was a melody of truth. To others, it was the song of a liar, a man who had spent too long in the company of myths. And so, the final chapters of his life were written in shadows and whispers. The same man who had stood beneath the golden roofs of Kublai Khan's palace, who had watched fireworks blossom like stars over Asian skies, died with many of his own countrymen, still unconvinced. But time has a way of shifting the tides. In the centuries after Matteo's final breath, the stories he'd poured into the world refused to fade. His manuscript, known in hushed voices as The Wonders of Matteo Perlo, was copied and carried across Europe. It was read in candlelit monasteries, where monks traced his words with reverent fingers. It was spoken aloud in smoky taverns, where sailors raised mugs and argued over whether such a world could truly exist. For some, it was scripture. For others, it was the fever dream of a man who had spent too many nights staring into the desert sun. But for nearly everyone who heard it, it stirred something that no doubt could smother the knowledge that the world was far wider than they had dared believe. Today, historians still debate Matteo's journey. They sift through ancient maps and old sea logs, weighing every phrase and every city name. They argue about what he saw, what he might have embroidered, and what he could never have truly known. But all of that, every word of speculation misses the point. Matteo Perlo did what few men of his time could even dream of. He connected worlds, not with sword or conquest, but with curiosity and the gentle art of listening. He left no throne behind, no army, to carve his name into the stones of history. Instead, he left a story, a single story, that would ripple outward like the rings on water when a stone is cast into the depths. His book would become a compass for the hearts of dreamers, a map for those who would one day dare to look beyond the horizon. And so it was that in the quiet libraries of Europe, under vaulted ceilings heavy with the weight of the past, Matteo's words found eager ears. Explorers traced his routes in their minds, letting the names of Asian cities fall from their lips like prayers. Geographers redrew their maps, no longer content with the edge of the known. Poets wrote verses of golden palaces and rivers that ran black as night. Matteo's voice was no longer just his own, it became a chorus of wonder that echoed through the ages. One of those who heard that echo was a young sailor from Genoa named Cristoforo Colombo. Long after Matteo's bones had turned to dust, Colombo read those words by the flickering glow of an oil lamp. He scrawled his own notes in the margins, tracing a path in his mind that would take him across the sea and into the unknown. For Colombo, Matteo's stories were not just tales. They were proof that the world was worth crossing. Matteo Perlo had not discovered new lands with flags and cannon fire. He had discovered the power of a tale told true, the quiet conquest of the heart that comes when someone dares to look beyond the horizon. He gave Europe not an empire, but a reason to believe that wonder was never out of reach. If Matteo had not lived, would Colombo have found the courage to sail west? Would merchants have dared the long roads of Persia and beyond? Would the poets of Europe have woven verses of jade and silk and sun-drenched deserts? We cannot know for sure, but we do know this. Matteo's voice carried them farther than any caravan or ship could travel. So tonight, as we close the final chapter of this story, let Matteo Perlo's journey remind us that there is always something waiting beyond the edge of the map. His footprints may be long washed away by time and tide, but his echo still calls to those with the courage to listen. And if this story has kindled even a spark of curiosity in your own heart, take a moment now to like this video, share it with your fellow seekers, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Because here at Stunning Story, we know that the horizon is never an end, it is only the beginning of the next great adventure. Imagine a queen whose power was so profound that even the air around her seemed to bow. Cleopatra, they said, was a master of the senses, a ruler who knew that scent was not just an adornment, but a promise, a herald of her approach. She soaked the sails of her royal barge in rosewater, letting the breeze carry whispers of her arrival long before she set foot on the riverbank. Her fragrance was her armor, her softest weapon, a way to bend perception before a single word was spoken. Even after death, the echoes of scent lingered in the dark tombs of Egypt. When the archaeologists pried open the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in 1922, they claimed the air still held the faint breath of ancient perfumes, a scent that had survived 3 millennia, a ghost of devotion and memory that refused to fade. In Egypt, scent was never mere beauty. It was the language of the soul, a thread binding the mortal to the eternal. As empires rose and fell, that thread was carried across the sands, mountains, and rivers of time. The art of fragrance drifted eastward, drawn by the winds of trade and the silent pull of ritual. In the cities of Mesopotamia, among the ziggurats and riverbanks of Sumer, perfume found new life. Clay tablets older than kingdoms described how to press cedar, myrrh, and cypress into scented oils. These were not just for the living, they were painted onto the statues of gods, rubbed onto the skin of priests, and sealed in urns that waited in the quiet earth. Even the earliest kings of these lands sought to smell like the heavens they worshipped. To them, the mingling of smoke and spice was not vanity, it was a covenant, an offering to forces far beyond the reach of mortal hands. Farther east, in the lush valleys of the Indus River and the ancient temples of India, scent was woven even deeper into the fabric of belief. The Vedic texts spoke of Gandha fragrance as an essential pillar of the sacred, an offering that turned prayers into breath and presence. In temples wreathed in garlands of jasmine and plumeria, the air itself was an act of worship. Every petal crushed, every drop of oil distilled, was a hymn to the unseen. Here, scent became both devotion and delight. It was love, the fragrance of flowers woven into a bride's hair. It was memory, the perfume of sandalwood paste on a grandfather's skin. India became one of the earliest lands to master the art of attar, distilling the essence of roses and vetiver into oils that shimmered like liquid dusk. In quiet workshops where the heat of the flame met the cool patience of water, artisans coaxed these essences drop by slow drop, creating perfumes that would outlast even the oldest empires. In the fragrant gardens of Persia, scent was an empire unto itself. Kings like Cyrus and Darius turned their palaces into oases of roses and violets, not merely for their beauty, but for the invisible power they carried on the wind. The Persian word for rose gul found its way into every line of poetry, every note of medicine, every promise whispered in the shade of a flowering arbor. Their architects designed palaces where the wind was a silent servant, carrying the scent of blossoms down marble halls. In these gardens, perfume was not just a luxury. It was an elegance, a mark of the refined and the wise. To be enveloped in fragrance was to be touched by grace itself. China, too, embraced the silent poetry of scent, though in its own soft and measured way. Here, perfume was not a roar, it was a quiet breath. Scholars would brush their inkstones with the faintest trace of sandalwood, letting its calm weight guide the strokes of their calligraphy. Robes were scented with cassia bark, not to boast but to soothe, a quiet gesture that spoke of balance and thought. In China, scent was reflection, a meditative offering to the mind's wandering and the heart's stillness. Across these ancient lands, perfume was no longer a simple offering to the gods or a mask for the dead. It had become a living art, a language without words. It was the soul of civilization itself, the silent signature left on every scroll, every temple wall, every bride's veil. As the world shifted westward, the quiet thread of perfume wove itself into the philosophies of Greece and the indulgences of Rome. What began as sacred incense in temples became, in these Mediterranean lands, a symbol of refinement, of sophistication, and at times of decadence. In the golden age of Greece, scent was both science and salvation. Physicians like Hippocrates saw in aromatic oils the power to heal not just the body, but the restless spirit. They prescribed fragrant baths of rose and myrrh to lift the weight of melancholy from the shoulders of the sick. The philosopher Theophrastus wrote treatises on the power of plants, claiming that the right scent could sharpen the intellect, stir the heart, and bring order to the storm of the mind. Yet scent in Greece was never without measure. In the gymnasiums where young men trained beneath the watchful gaze of marble statues, scented oils were rubbed onto limbs hardened by wrestling and sun. But to wear too much was to invite whispers of vanity, or worse, of weakness. Moderation was the Greek creed, even in the matters of the heart and the senses. But in Rome, moderation was often left behind with the dust of the road. The empire of the Caesars embraced perfume with a hunger that echoed its conquests. Wealthy Romans turned their feasts into fragrant pageants. Servants would scatter rose petals across marble floors until the air itself seemed to sigh with sweetness. Banquet halls would be drenched in perfumed snow, drifting down from the ceilings like the last dream of spring. Emperors like Nero spent fortunes to bring scent from the ends of the earth, believing that no cost was too great if it meant weaving a moment of wonder into the dark folds of Roman night. In these halls of excess, perfume was no longer just a comfort, it was a display of power, a challenge to any who might question the might of Rome. Yet even in this world of grandeur, there was still a memory of scent's older, quieter magic. Roman poets wrote verses that spoke of perfume not as a luxury, but as a bridge between memory and longing. The faint scent of myrtle in a lover's hair, the ghost of frankincense in a temple's cold shadow. These were the echoes that wove together the lives of the living and the whispers of the dead. So, as we gather tonight to speak of fragrance, let us remember, it was never just about the sweet weight of a flower on the wind. It was about the promise of a world beyond sight, a world where devotion, power, and memory were written in scent. From the riverbanks of the Nile to the gardens of Persia, from the quiet study of a Chinese scholar to the thunder of a Roman feast, perfume was civilization's most intimate language. If tonight's story has opened your mind to the ancient art of scent, if you've felt the weight of history in every breath, don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow seekers, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Because here on Stunning Story, we believe every breath carries a memory, and every scent is a journey waiting to be told. Picture this, the scent of rose petals drifting on the Nile, a queen's barge gliding silently in the night. Cleopatra knew the power of perfume better than any ruler before her. She was a sorceress of scent. They said she would soak the sails of her barge in rose water, letting the breeze whisper of her arrival long before her silhouette even graced the horizon. Her fragrance was a promise, a herald that her power had already arrived. This mastery of scent would echo far beyond the banks of the Nile. In the marble palaces of Rome, Cleopatra's memory lingered like an intoxicating sigh. The wealthy of the empire learned to wield perfume not just as ornament, but as declaration. In Rome, perfume was no longer just worn, it was performed. Glass vessels were crafted as delicate as the breath of a lover, designed to hold rare oils with the reverence of a temple. Perfume makers, known as the alchemistes of fragrance, became artisans whose skill was more valuable than gold. Roman baths, those grand arenas of steam and conversation, dedicated entire rooms to fragrance. Clouds of scented steam turned the air itself into a balm for the weary body and mind. Streets and public halls carried the perfume of spices and flowers, turning daily life into a theater of scent. Yet beneath this luxury, tension brewed like thunder on the horizon. Moralists like Seneca and Pliny the Elder railed against this fragrant indulgence, warning that perfume was a soft poison, a distraction from virtue, a snare for the soul. As the slow breath of Christianity spread through the empire, suspicion deepened. The church, born in the hush of prayer and the flicker of candlelight, viewed perfume as a worldly excess, a temptation that smelled of sin and luxury best left behind. And so, as the old world of Rome crumbled, scent faded too. The baths fell silent. The amphorae of rare oils cracked and emptied. The rituals of scent that had once spoken of gods and emperors slipped away like a dream at dawn. But the story was not over. In the east, a different world was stirring, ready to breathe new life into fragrance and to send it back to the lands that had once turned away. As the West recoiled from perfume's indulgence, the Islamic world embraced it as a sacred tradition. From the 7th century onward, the rise of Islam brought with it a profound respect for cleanliness, beauty, and the subtle power of scent. The Prophet Muhammad himself spoke of fragrance as one of life's greatest blessings, a gift to be worn before prayer, a courtesy to guests, an expression of faith as deep as any verse of the Quran. In this new world of devotion and discovery, cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became the heart of perfume's renaissance. Perfumers, known as Adarine, were both artisans and alchemists. They perfected the art of distillation, turning flowers and woods and resins into whispers of eternity. They captured the breath of jasmine and rose, the warmth of myrrh and sandalwood, using techniques that would humble the grandest workshops of Rome. One name shone above them all: Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. This Persian polymath, whose mind was a garden of medicine and philosophy, gave the world steam distillation. It was a revolution. With it, perfumers could draw out the purest essence of a flower, crafting oils that were more delicate, more constant, and more lasting than anything known in Europe. In Ibn Sina's glass retorts and copper alembics, perfume became an art of precision, the science of turning the invisible into the unforgettable. Arab traders carried these treasures along the Silk Roads, over mountains and through deserts, like pilgrims carrying the secret of a distant shrine. Frankincense from Oman, musk from the snowy slopes of Tibet, ambergris from the ocean's edge, all found their way into flasks of green glass and chased silver, moving from the marketplaces of India to the courts of Spain. Every caravan that wound its way across the dust and the salt left behind not just footprints, but the faint, lingering breath of other worlds. In the Islamic world, scent was never just for pleasure. It was woven into the rhythm of life itself. Mosques were perfumed with gentle smoke before each prayer, the air turning sweet and sacred as voices rose in devotion. Homes welcomed visitors with scented hands, a gesture of hospitality as warm as the sun. Even the pages of holy books were sometimes lightly scented, a quiet testament that the divine was never far from the human. While Europe saw perfume as a temptation to be purged, the Islamic world lifted it up as an offering, a way to honor the soul, the earth, and the spaces where the two meet. And so, as the centuries turned as crusades rose and fell and the long fingers of trade reached farther than ever before. The knowledge preserved and perfected in the East began to seep back into a Europe that was finally ready to fall in love with scent once more. Yet perfume's return to the West was not wrapped in luxury. It arrived in the shadow of fear. The continent was gripped by plague, a terror that crept through the streets like a silent thief. Physicians spoke of miasma, of foul air that carried death on every breeze. Germs were not yet understood, but the reek of sickness was a herald none could ignore, and so scent became armor, a fragile defense against the invisible enemy. Doctors donned the strange, beaked masks that haunt our imaginations even now, leather and cloth shaped like the curved bill of a carrion bird, each beak stuffed with cloves, lavender, and cinnamon. These plague masks, both ominous and strangely hopeful, were meant to turn the air sweet, to ward off death itself with every breath. Nobles and merchants carried pomanders, small spheres of silver or gold filled with a symphony of spices. As they walked the narrow streets of medieval cities, they held them close, breathing in the promise of safety. Churches burned incense not just to honor the sacred, but to cleanse the air of demons they could not see. Ironically, as fear turned perfume into protection, water fell out of favor. Bathing, once a ritual of Rome's marble halls, became suspect. The open pores of clean skin were seen as invitations to the plague. So scent became the last refuge of comfort, the only balm for bodies that were no longer washed, for streets no longer swept. Heavy oils and deep musks were layered onto skin, unwashed for weeks, turning the body into both shrine and shield. Clothes were soaked in herbs, gloves steeped in orange blossom and crushed cinnamon. It was a strange balance, the reek of survival and the breath of luxury intertwined. And so, through war and plague, through faith and fear, the quiet art of scent endured. It traveled on the breath of traders and the dreams of poets, across seas and deserts, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there was beauty to be found. If tonight's tale of rosewater sails and the science of steam, of miasma and memory, has sparked something in you, if you felt the quiet power of scent as it wove through centuries of fear and devotion, don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow dreamers, and let me know where you're watching from. Because here at Stunning Story, we know that every scent is a story, and every story is a journey waiting to be told. Imagine a world where every breath was an act of resistance, where the air itself was a battlefield between fear and beauty. In the shadow of plague and superstition, Europe trembled. But even as the streets stank of disease, there were those who refused to let the art of scent slip into oblivion. Amidst this fear, knowledge was reborn, a quiet revolution, carried not on the swords of conquerors, but on the perfumed breeze of memory. It was through the dusty paths of crusaders and the whispered bargains of traders that Europe rediscovered the forgotten science of distillation. In the cloisters of monasteries, where time itself seemed to slow, monks turned their eyes from scripture to the silent mysteries of herbs. In Spain and Italy, alchemists stirred copper stills by moonlight, coaxing the essence of roses, lavender, and rosemary from their green hiding places. These were men who believed that scent was more than a mask. It was a key to understanding the very soul of the world. One of the first glimpses of perfume's rebirth came in Hungary in the 14th century. Known as Hungary water, it was a blend of rosemary and wine spirits, said to restore youth and beauty to Queen Elizabeth of Hungary herself. Light as morning mist, it marked the beginning of a new chapter 1, where perfume began to drift away from the heavy oils of old and toward the bright, fleeting spirits that promised renewal. But the true revolution of scent was still waiting in the hills of southern France. Tucked into the warm embrace of Provence was a city called Grasse, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with the promise of new beginnings. Once known for the acrid trade of tanning leather, Grasse carried the smell of raw hides and sweat. But all that changed with the arrival of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, who brought with her a love of fragrance that would change the city's fate forever. Catherine had a personal perfumer, a man whose craft was as delicate as the petals he distilled. He began to scent the gloves of Grass's leather workers, masking the pungent bite of the tanner's trade with the breath of lavender and rose. What began as a simple act of courtesy soon became a tidal wave of desire. Grass turned its face from leather to lavender, and the sun-drenched fields around the city bloomed with the flowers of tomorrow. At dawn, women with hands stained by petals would rise to gather roses before the sun's warmth stole their secret. Jasmine was plucked in the hush of night, its fragrance captured while the world still dreamed. Orange blossoms and violets, crushed and coaxed into delicate oils, turned the very air of Grass into an alchemy of hope. What had begun as a way to hide the stench of sweat became a national obsession. As the French court slipped deeper into its silken rituals, perfume became the breath of fashion itself. Versailles, the grand palace of Louis XIV, was a temple of scent. Orange water perfumed the halls where lords and ladies danced in whispers. Furniture was polished with scented wax. Even the fountains were rumored to spray rosewater during royal celebrations, turning every corner of the court into a fragrant stage. Yet behind the shimmer of luxury lay necessity. In a world where bathing was still rare and sweat clung to bodies like a second skin, perfume became a shield, the only defense against the reality that lay beneath silk and satin. Nobles changed their clothes not to be clean, but to appear fresh. They layered scent upon scent, turning their very presence into a performance of roses and musk. Perfumers became more than craftsmen. They were artisans, their recipes guarded like state secrets, their workshops alight with the glow of midnight oil. They learned to balance top notes that sparkled like laughter, heart notes that wrapped around the soul, and bass notes that whispered of the earth itself. Scent became a symphony, each bottle a fleeting melody of desire and memory. As the 18th century dawned, the Enlightenment swept across Europe, and with it came the bright promise of science. Chemistry blossomed, turning glass flasks and copper retorts into instruments of precision. Alcohol-based perfumes grew more stable, their notes clearer and more enduring. Bottles became works of art, cut crystal and etched glass that turned each drop of scent into a jewel for the senses. Paris became the new heart of perfume. Shops opened their doors to the curious and the fashionable, offering scents crafted to echo a lover's sigh or a dream of distant shores. Perfume was no longer a whisper to the divine or a shield against decay. It had become luxury itself, an invisible mark of identity, a language spoken in the hush of skin and the flicker of a pulse. But the world was changing faster than even the most skilled perfumer could keep pace with. The 19th century arrived like a thunderclap. Industrial revolutions rose from the smoke of iron and coal, reshaping cities and tearing down the old barriers of class. Art, fashion, and science collided in a swirl of invention and ambition. In this whirlwind, perfume stepped forward into modernity, no longer the province of priests or kings, but a treasure for every soul bold enough to claim it. For the first time, scent became deeply personal. No longer just the adornment of emperors or the tool of priests, it was the breath of 1,000 quiet rebellions, an expression of self that could slip beneath the notice of the world, yet mark a life forever. Scientific breakthroughs transformed the art of scent into a new frontier. Chemists learned to isolate aroma molecules, to capture the fleeting essence of flowers and the soft musk of earth in ways no garden could offer. They discovered synthetic compounds like coumarin, the sweet scent of hay at dusk, and vanillin, that warm ghost of vanilla that lingers in the memory long after it fades from the air. Suddenly, perfumers were not just distillers of nature's bounty, they were composers, building fragrances like music. They layered top notes that shimmered with laughter, heart notes that drew the breath of the soul, and bass notes that grounded it all in the patient hum of the earth. The craft became an art of balance, a dance of invisible threads. Perfume no longer depended solely on the whims of harvest and the secrets of distant lands. It could be created, refined, and imagined anew. A revolution of scent was unfolding, a promise that even in a world of smoke and machines, the soul of the flower could still bloom. And so, across Europe's crowded boulevards and the quiet alleys where poets whispered to the night, perfume became a companion to the restless heart. A touch of memory on the wrist, a kiss of longing at the throat, each drop a bridge between the seen and the felt, the known and the possible. If tonight's tale of rose-scented gloves and the alchemy of the East has stirred your own sense of wonder, if you felt the weight of a single breath carrying centuries of memory, don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow seekers, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because here at Stunning Story, we know that even the quietest scent can carry the loudest echo of history, and every journey is a story waiting to be told. Imagine a scent that could linger long after a single word was spoken, a breath of memory that clung to skin like a whispered promise. In 1889, a new chapter was written in the language of perfume. Jiki by Givaudan, one of the first fragrances to blend the pulse of nature with the sharp clarity of synthetic molecules, did not smell like a flower or a fruit. It smelled like a secret, a mystery that wove itself into the very air. It was the dawn of modern perfumery, and with it, scent became more than an echo of nature. It became a story, an identity worn like armor. As the 20th century unfurled, perfume found a new purpose. No longer a luxury reserved for temples and courts, it became an expression of the self, a signature for the soul. Bottles were shaped like sculptures, each one a quiet monument to the invisible art within. Advertisements promised more than a scent. They promised transformation, the chance to become whoever you dared to dream of being. And then came 1921, when a revolution wrapped itself in a bottle of glass and gold. Chanel No. 5, created by perfumer Ernest Beau and the visionary Coco Chanel, didn't just break the rules. It rewrote them. No longer did a perfume have to smell of roses or violets. Chanel wanted a fragrance that spoke not of petals but of power, a scent that captured the essence of a woman, not a garden. The world listened. No. 5 became an anthem of elegance, a quiet rebellion worn on the skin of women who refused to be defined by tradition. It was clean and modern, yet carried a depth that defied explanation. In every spritz, there was a challenge: to be seen, to be felt, to be remembered. Perfume had traveled far from the smoky temples of the ancients. It was now wrapped in cellophane, sold in department stores, worn to dinners, dances, and whispered rendezvous in the flicker of candlelight. It had become invisible fashion, a mood, a memory, a breath of the soul made tangible. As the decades turned, perfume grew bolder, its notes a reflection of the times. The 20th century was an era of both glamour and devastation, and scent moved in rhythm with each new chapter. When the world was at war, perfume adapted. Jasmine fields lay abandoned, their flowers lost to the roar of cannons. Trade routes that once carried frankincense and myrrh fell silent beneath the weight of conflict. But even as bombs fell and cities burned, perfumers refused to surrender. Some turned to synthetic substitutes, crafting new blends from what the earth could no longer yield. Others rationed the precious essences of rose and sandalwood, creating scents that spoke not of opulence but of resilience. The heavy, decadent perfumes of the pre-war years gave way to simplicity lighter colognes that echoed the quiet determination of a world learning to stand again. And in the trenches and the barracks, perfume found a new role. Soldiers carried letters scented with the perfume of loved ones left behind. A single note of jasmine, a wisp of rose, could become a lifeline, a promise that beyond the mud and blood, there was still something gentle waiting to be claimed. The scent of a lover's hair, caught in the weave of a scarf or the collar of a coat, became a prayer in the darkness. When the last shots faded and the world turned once more to the business of living, scent rose with the dawn. The 1950s and 60s saw perfume slip back into the bright glow of pop culture. No longer the hidden indulgence of a few, it was mass-produced, advertised in glossy magazines, and carried on the skin of silver screen icons. Marilyn Monroe, with a single line, "I wear nothing to bed but Chanel No. 5, turned a fragrance into legend. Perfume counters became altars of transformation. Each bottle offered a new persona, elegant and poised, innocent and daring, soft as a summer night, or as sharp as the first frost of winter. Fragrance was no longer just a scent. It was a story waiting to be told. Men, too, found themselves seduced by the promise of scent. New colognes balanced the rugged weight of masculinity with a refinement that spoke of quiet confidence. A splash of citrus and cedar could make a man feel both warrior and poet, both rooted and restless. The 1,980 swaggered in with shoulder pads and neon, and perfume rose to meet the moment. Power scents bold, unapologetic became the calling cards of a generation that refused to whisper. These fragrances were declarations, sharp as ambition, rich as a Wall Street deal sealed with a handshake. Yet even as the world flexed its muscles, a quieter question stirred. By the end of the century, people began to ask what lay hidden in the glass flacons that lined their shelves. Ingredients, sustainability, the ethics of creation. These whispers grew louder. The demand for honesty, for transparency, began to reshape the world of scent. Niche perfumes emerged from the shadows of mass production, crafting small batch fragrances that spoke of memory and rebellion. They were bottles of story, each one a poem of place and time. Artisans blended notes of wood smoke and rain, of leather and the green hush of spring scents that refused to be confined to the predictable. In these new fragrances, perfume was no longer just an accessory. It was authenticity, worn like a secret. And so, as the century drew to a close, perfume had become a mirror. It reflected a world that was both more connected and more divided than ever, a world hungry for meaning, for identity, for a trace of memory that could not be digitized or reduced to pixels on a screen. Today, we live in an age where everything moves at the speed of light. We scroll, swipe, and stream, caught in an endless current of images and sound. But even in this digital tide, scent remains something different, something that no algorithm can replicate. Perfume is analog, timeless, a breath of the past held in the present. The story of fragrance is not just about oils and alcohols, not just about the alchemy of distillation. It's about the longing that has always lived within us, the need to carry a piece of the world's wonder close to the skin, to write our stories in the language of the senses. If tonight's journey from rose-soaked sails to the quiet laboratories of grass, from the smoky halls of Rome to the power scents of a modern age has stirred your imagination, take a moment now to like this video. Share it with your fellow seekers and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because here on Stunning Story, we believe that even in the quiet breath of scent, there is a universe waiting to be explored, and every journey begins with a single, unforgettable note. Imagine this, a scent that cannot be captured by a camera or compressed into data. You can't download it, you can't post it, you must wear it. Let it linger, let it become a part of you. And maybe that's why, after centuries of empires and revolutions, perfume still matters. Because even in a world that moves at the speed of light, some things remain deeply, unshakably human. In these last few years, the world of scent has entered a new age, an era of curiosity, reinvention, and introspection. Across quiet studios and echoing laboratories, perfumers have become poets and rebels. Niche houses have risen, crafting small-batch fragrances that are less about trends and more about stories. These perfumes smell not of roses or musk alone, but of parchment and forest rain, of antique leather and the soft ache of nostalgia itself. We live in an age that demands authenticity, and perfume has answered. Today's seekers want more than the easy sweetness of a designer bottle. They want something personal, a scent that feels like memory pressed into the hollow of the throat. Perfume has become a secret language again, a way of whispering who you are to those close enough to listen. In quiet corners of the world, artisans write their formulas like love letters. They source their ingredients with care petals gathered at dawn, resins pulled from ancient forests. They blend and distill not in factories, but in sanctuaries of scent, where each drop is a promise and each note a memory. These perfumers are not just chemists. They are storytellers, weaving the language of the earth into something you can wear on your skin. Yet even as tradition hums in the background, science has opened new doors. We can now map the molecular structure of a scent as precisely as a constellation. We can recreate flowers that no longer bloom in the wild, the breath of a lost world captured in a single vial. Some have even turned to the shimmering mind of artificial intelligence, feeding it the poetry of scent and asking it to weave new harmonies never imagined before. There is a quiet revolution unfolding here. Sustainability has become the new luxury. Perfume houses now speak of ethical sourcing, of biodegradable ingredients and bottles that can be refilled, because true beauty should never come at the cost of the world that gives it breath. In a marketplace where illusion is easy, the authenticity of a single rose petal can feel like an act of quiet defiance. And yet, for all the technology, for all the glass and chrome, the reason we reach for perfume remains the same as it was in the courts of Persia or the temples of Egypt: memory. A single breath of lavender can carry you to a childhood garden. A wisp of tobacco can recall the warmth of a grandfather's study. Perfume is our invisible diary, a way to be remembered or to remember. From the flickering fires of ancient Egypt to the neon glow of modern cities, from the soldiers who clutched scented letters in trenches to the quiet hum of digital labs where scent is remade in code, perfume has traced the edges of what it means to be human. It is history you can wear, emotion made vapor, presence in absence. As long as we long to be seen, to be cherished, to be felt, scent will have a place in our hearts. In the final breaths of the 1500s, while perfume was weaving its own quiet revolutions, Italy was alive with transformation. The Renaissance had pulled the past into the present, breathing life into old stone and older stories. Painters reached for the divine with every stroke of a brush. Architects raised domes that curved like the earth's own dreams. But it was the musicians who chased something even more elusive. They asked, what did ancient Greek drama sound like? This wasn't a question of curiosity alone. It was a question of the soul. The thinkers of that age believed that in the golden age of Sophocles and Euripides, there had been no distance between word and song. That speech itself had once been music, and that in finding that ancient harmony, they could unlock something lost, something essential. In the candlelit halls of Florence, a small group of poets, composers, and scholars gathered around Count Giovanni de Bardi. They called themselves the Camerata. Their mission was as bold as it was humble: to recreate the emotional power of Greek tragedy, not through grandeur or spectacle, but through the quiet force of sound. They rejected the complex polyphony that filled the cathedrals. They believed that true power lay in simplicity, in the rise and fall of a single voice, in melody that echoed the human heart. Among them was Vincenzo Galilei, father of the astronomer Galileo. Vincenzo spoke with the certainty of one who has looked up at the stars and found them in his own chest. Harmony, he argued, was not about weaving 1,000 voices into one. It was about letting a single voice carry the weight of feeling, to rise and fall like breath. It was a radical idea that melody, not complexity, was the key to the soul. From these quiet gatherings was born something entirely new: monody, a single melodic line, one voice supported by the soft echo of strings or the patient hum of a harpsichord. It wasn't opera, not yet. But it was the first breath of a new world, where music was no longer just an adornment to words but a companion, a second heart beating beneath the poetry. The first experiments were small court performances, private gatherings where the rich tapestries of myth were pulled down from the walls and sung back to life. The air itself seemed to shimmer as these early songs filled the room, each note a bridge between memory and possibility. This was not the music of churches or the madrigals of feasting halls. This was something new, a theater of sound. It was living, breathing, a music that wore its own humanity like a cloak. Slowly, inevitably, this delicate art began to take shape. It was no longer just an echo of the past. It was a new language, spoken in the hush of a chamber and the bright glow of a candle. It was music that didn't just tell a story, it became the story. Every rise and fall of the voice was a step in a journey, every pause a chance to feel the weight of a word. So tonight, as we close this chapter on the breath of flowers and the song of voices, let us remember that what began in the altars of the Nile and the markets of Damascus found its way into every corner of our lives. Perfume and music, both born of the same longing, to turn the fleeting into the eternal, to take the smallest whisper of the heart and let it echo beyond the boundaries of flesh and time. If you felt even a flicker of that ancient wonder tonight, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who also believe in the power of scent and sound, and tell us where you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, every breath is a tale, and every note a promise waiting to be remembered. Imagine it, the hush of a candlelit room, a single voice trembling in the air, and an audience that leaned forward, breathless, not realizing they were witnessing the birth of something ancient and yet entirely new. Opera, though unnamed, had taken its first breath. The Florentine Camerata, that quiet circle of poets, composers, and philosophers, never intended to create a whole new art form. They saw themselves as archaeologists of sound, trying to unearth the lost music of Greece's golden age. They wanted to restore what they believed had been stripped away by centuries of complexity, the raw power of a single voice, carrying truth through melody, as direct as speech itself. But in that search for ancient echoes, they found something eternal. Their experiments with monody, a style of solo singing accompanied by sparse chords, quickly evolved beyond mere revival. They began blending recitation with melody, creating compositions that moved between word and song. Characters now revealed their hearts not just with lines of poetry, but with the rise and fall of their voices, like the natural swell of human breath. The result was recitative, the heartbeat of early opera. In 1597, composer Jacopo Peri unveiled Daphne, an intimate performance crafted for the Florentine elite. It was based on the myth of Daphne and Apollo, the story of love that could never be. Only fragments of that first performance remain, but its impact was profound. For the first time, music didn't just frame the story, it carried it. Peri followed Daphne with Eurydice in 1600, composed for the wedding of Maria de' Medici to King Henry IV of France. This was the first complete opera that survives to this day. Though primitive by modern standards, Eurydice contained the essential elements: sung dialogue, solo arias, choruses, and instrumental interludes. It was both ritual and innovation, the sound of a new art form emerging from the shadows of history. Another voice soon joined this quiet revolution: Giulio Caccini. His collection, Le Nuove Musiche, published in 1602, featured solo songs that were more ornamented and expressive than Peri's stark recitatives. In these pieces, the voice did not just speak. It lingered, soared, and revealed the inexpressible. Caccini's music was a glimpse of the aria, a moment for the singer to step into the light and let emotion bloom. These early operas were small in scale, performed in courtly chambers rather than grand theaters. They had no towering sets, no swirling masses of dancers. They were chamber dramas, designed to stir the souls of those lucky enough to witness them. But even in their modesty, they hinted at the vast potential of opera, music that didn't just accompany life's great dramas, but became them. The Camerata had longed to revive the ancient world, to breathe life into myths that had once moved entire cities to tears. Instead, they created something entirely modern, a fusion of poetry, performance, and music, a mirror of the human soul, captured in melody. And while Peri and Caccini laid the first stones of this new art, it was Claudio Monteverdi who turned it into a cathedral. Born in Cremona in 1567, Monteverdi stood at the crossroads of two ages: the refined complexities of the Renaissance and the bold expressiveness of the Baroque. Trained in the polyphonic madrigals of his time, he understood how to weave voices together into a tapestry of harmony. But he also saw that music could be more than beauty. It could be truth. Where Peri and Caccini had built the frame, Monteverdi painted the soul. In 1607, he premiered L'Orfeo in Mantua, retelling the myth of Orpheus, the musician who dared to descend into the underworld to reclaim his lost love, Eurydice. The story had already been touched by music, but Monteverdi's version was different. It wasn't just scenes stitched together. It was a unified drama, where every note, every word, every silence was part of a single breath. L'Orfeo featured a full orchestra rare and lavish for the time, with strings, harps, recorders, flutes, cornets, and even the mournful brass of trombones. It opened with a lively toccata, calling the audience to attention like a trumpet blast at the gates of a city. Then came the prologue, sung by music herself, who promised to lead the listeners through joy and sorrow alike. The drama that followed was unlike anything seen before. Recitatives flowed like conversation, urgent and natural. Arias moments of pure feeling rose like laments in the night. Choruses answered, weaving the voices of many into the thoughts of a single soul. Instrumental interludes stitched these moments together, turning pauses into promises. What made L'Orfeo revolutionary was not just its scale, it was its heart. Monteverdi didn't treat music as a pretty backdrop. He made it the very blood of the story. When Orpheus sang of hope, the music danced like sunlight on water. When he wept, it bled. When he defied the gods, the harmonies twisted and turned like the river of fate itself. The emotions weren't suggested. They were made flesh, audible, immediate, undeniable. L'Orfeo was more than a performance. It was a revelation. The court of Mantua, accustomed to polite entertainments, was stunned. Here was music that lived and breathed music, that could shatter a heart or lift it to the heavens. It proved that opera was not a passing experiment or a noble curiosity. It was the future, echoing in every note. In the centuries that followed, opera would grow grander. Stages would swell to hold armies of singers, and chandeliers would rise to the heights of marble domes. But the soul of it, that quiet breath that began in the small rooms of Florence, would remain unchanged. It was a promise that music could speak the language of the heart more clearly than words alone. Tonight, as we close this chapter on the birth of opera, let us remember that what began as a humble quest to revive the past became a new way of being. The Florentine Camerata didn't set out to invent opera. They simply followed the thread of human feeling, and in doing so, wove a new world. If you felt the pull of those first notes, the hush of a recitative, the ache of a melody, don't forget to like this video. Share it with those who still believe in the power of art, and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, we know that every note is a journey, and every journey begins with the courage to feel. Picture this, a world where music wasn't just an art, it was a force that could sway hearts and shatter illusions. In the hands of Monteverdi, opera became more than a theory. It became theater, a living, breathing expression of what it meant to be human. With works like L'Arianna and Il Ritorno d'Ulisse in Patria, Monteverdi showed that opera could hold both grandeur and intimacy in a single breath. Though many of these early works are lost to time, their echoes still shape every note sung on modern stages. He proved that myth, music, and human frailty could share the same stage, their stories stitched together by melody. In Monteverdi's hands, opera was no longer a dusty revival of ancient Greece. It was alive, a bright new star blazing across Europe's cultural sky. But perhaps the most radical transformation came not in the salons of Florence or the courts of Mantua, but in the water-lapped alleys of Venice. In 1637, something extraordinary happened. The first public opera house, the Teatro San Cassiano, opened its doors to the citizens of Venice. For the first time in history, opera was no longer the private pleasure of dukes and scholars. It belonged to the people. Anyone with the price of a ticket could step inside and witness the magic once reserved for gilded halls. Venice was the perfect cradle for this transformation, a city built on trade and mystery, where every mask at carnival hid 1,000 secrets. Here, drama already pulsed through the canals. Opera simply slipped into the rhythm, adding another layer of wonder to a city that never stopped dreaming. Soon, more theaters bloomed across Venice like flowers of stone and velvet. By the mid-1600s, the city boasted over a dozen opera houses, each one competing to outshine the others. The opera season aligned with Carnival, a season of revelry, masks, and whispers, where music and masquerade were one and the same. This new, paying audience changed everything. Composers began to write not just for noble ears, but for the passions of the crowd. Arias grew longer, more elaborate, designed to showcase the voices that could make hearts shudder and spirits soar. Plots shifted toward tales of romance and betrayal, of masked lovers and glittering revenge. The stage itself became a wonderland. Ships seemed to sail across oceans of painted canvas. Palaces rose and fell from trapdoors, and infernos flickered beneath feet that never danced the same step twice. Theaters themselves evolved to embrace the thrill of this new era. Boxes lined the walls, offering noble families a private world of luxury above the crush of the pit, where the general public pressed close, breathless for every note. Opera was no longer just an earful of music. It was a feast for the eyes, a spectacle where sight and sound fused in an alchemy of sensation. In this new age, a strange and haunting figure rose to the center of the stage, the castrato. These were male singers who, as boys, had been subjected to a brutal practice, their voices preserved in a high register that no natural man could match. The cost was immeasurable, yet their voices were unlike anything else in the world. Agile, brilliant, and almost otherworldly, they soared over orchestras like the cry of an angel and thundered like the wrath of gods. The castrati became the superstars of the 17th and 18th centuries, admired, envied, and whispered about in every corner of Europe. Their names were written in letters of gold on theater posters. They commanded fortunes for a single aria, their voices leaving audiences trembling with awe. Some lived lives of dazzling luxury, collecting art, lovers, and legends wherever they went. Composers quickly learned to write with these singular voices in mind. Operas became intricate frameworks built to showcase their power like jeweled boxes, designed to catch the light of a single gem. The da capo aria, with its ABA structure, became the canvas for their virtuosity. A simple melody sung with grace, followed by a return adorned with dazzling improvisation. This was the moment audiences craved. The singer alone in the spotlight, the world holding its breath as he turned music into magic. The theater itself was transformed. No longer just a place for stories, it became a temple of the voice. Crowds flocked to hear what seemed humanly impossible trills that shimmered like moonlight on water, leaps that defied gravity, and lines spun out on a single breath that seemed to last forever. The castrati were both marvel and mystery, their power matched only by the questions that followed them like shadows. But they were not alone in their glory. Sopranos and tenors also rose to claim the stage, each staking their claim to the emotional heights of opera. The grieving queen, the desperate lover, the betrayed hero, these roles became vessels for vocal brilliance, turning each performance into a battle of souls laid bare. A singer might hold the stage for 10 minutes or more, turning an aria into an epic of longing and triumph. The power of opera was no longer just in its stories, but in the raw force of the human voice, that most fragile and fierce of instruments, able to shatter the heart or lift it to the stars. In Venice, opera had become a business, a blend of art and commerce that fed on the city's insatiable appetite for wonder. It was no longer a scholarly exercise or a pious revival of ancient Greece. It was something fully alive, unpredictable, grand, and heartbreakingly human. As opera flourished in Venice and beyond, one thing became clear. The stage belonged not to kings or philosophers, but to the voice. The castrati, the sopranos, the tenors, they were the ones who carried the soul of the music in their breath, the ones who turned each performance into a moment that could never be repeated. And so opera became what it remains today, a testament to what is possible when the human spirit dares to speak in song. From the candlelit chambers of Florence to the blazing footlights of Venice, from the measured lines of myth to the fevered improvisations of the da capo aria, Opera was and is a world where every note is a promise and every breath a journey. If tonight's story of Venice's shimmering stages and the haunting voices of the castrati has stirred your imagination, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe in the power of the human voice, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, every performance is a prayer to the beauty of being alive, and every story waits to be sung. Imagine it, a single voice that could cut through the silence of 1,000 hearts, a note stretched so far it became both prayer and rebellion. In the golden age of virtuosity, the voice was not merely an instrument, it was a kingdom, and those who could wield it were kings and queens in their own right. Opera had become a stage for these voices, a space where myth and music bowed to the power of human breath. Audiences no longer came simply for the story. They came to worship the singer. And composers, ever aware of where the true power lay, began shaping their scores not around philosophy or history, but around the voices that would bring them to life. Venice had given opera its first breath of freedom, its public stage. But other Italian cities would soon leave their own indelible marks, each shaping the art into something both new and uniquely their own. Chief among these cities were Rome and Naples. In Rome, the weight of the church lay heavy on the art form. The papal states, governed by piety and power, placed strict boundaries on public performances. But creativity never dies, it simply finds new roots. Roman opera adapted, drawing its drama from the sacred as much as the profane. The stage became a place where moral gravity and divine mystery met. Female performers were often barred, so male singers, the castrati, stepped into female roles, creating a strange, ethereal world where gender was fluid and the voice transcended the limits of the body. The staging in Rome was lavish, gods descending from the heavens on hidden wires, vast sets shifting like dreams in the flicker of candlelight. The language was elevated, the plots drawn from scripture and allegory. Each performance was a kind of sacred illusion, where devotion and spectacle danced together in the hush of the theater. Then there was Naples, a city that burned with a different fire. Naples became a crucible for technical brilliance and raw emotion, a place where music itself seemed to weep and soar. The Spanish Bourbon court and the city's renowned conservatories turned Naples into Europe's musical heartbeat. Here, opera seria took its final shining form. The stories told in Neapolitan opera were drawn from ancient myths and heroic tales. Justice, sacrifice, and virtue were its pillars, each act unfolding with the careful elegance of a ritual. Composers like Alessandro Scarlatti refined these rules, crafting operas that were both structured and soul-stirring. In Naples, the voice was everything. Singers were pushed to the edges of their breath, every aria a test of endurance and grace. The Da Capo aria, with its structure of statement, departure, and triumphant return, became a showcase for vocal brilliance, a moment for the singer to step beyond the page and into legend. Naples was a city of feeling, and it turned opera into a training ground for the greatest voices Europe would ever hear. From here, the echoes of those voices traveled outward, carrying Naples' passion to every corner of the continent. As the 18th century dawned, Italy was no longer just the cradle of opera. It was its heart, beating with the rhythm of 1,000 arias. But the music did not stop at the borders of the Italian peninsula. It traveled, carried by singers, composers, and the quiet fascination of nobles who longed to hear the impossible made real. Northward and outward, opera took root in new soils. In France, it found itself reborn in a form that suited the grandeur of the Sun King's court. Under Louis XIV, the genre of tragédie lyrique emerged, a magnificent fusion of dance, chorus, and dramatic stagecraft, all draped in the weighty elegance of French classicism. Here, music was not just for the ear, but for the eye as well. Jean-Baptiste Lully, and later Rameau, took the lessons of Italy and wove them into something uniquely French operas that were not just performances, but living paintings, where every note was a brushstroke. Italian opera, with its focus on vocal brilliance and fluid storytelling, was both admired and resisted in France. Many French aristocrats could not deny its allure, slipping into Italian performances like secret lovers of forbidden beauty. But in the salons of Paris, opera would forever carry the mark of French identity, a grandeur that spoke of Versailles and the hush of velvet curtains. In Germany, too, opera began to find its own voice. The courts of German princes became eager patrons, drawing Italian composers and castrati northward. A young George Frederick Handel, long before he found his home in London, walked the streets of Florence and Rome, drinking deeply from the well of Italian style. He carried those lessons back with him, blending them with the weight of German polyphony and the clarity of his own genius. Opera was becoming a European phenomenon, no longer confined to the candlelit salons of Florence or the golden glow of Venice. It had become a river of sound, flowing across borders and into the hearts of those who had never seen the canals of Venice or the skies of Naples. Yet for all its grandeur, for all the shifting stages and gilded ceilings, the soul of opera remained the same, the human voice, stretched to its furthest edge. In an age of virtuosity, the voice was king, and as long as there were hearts that longed to feel to be broken and remade by a single breath, opera would always have a stage. If tonight's story of sacred illusions in Rome and the fiery passions of Naples has awakened your own curiosity, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe in the power of song, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, we know that every note, every stage, every breath is a doorway to a world beyond the ordinary, a world that waits for you to step inside. Imagine standing in a darkened theater, the hush of anticipation so thick it feels like the air itself is holding its breath. In the glow of flickering lamps, a figure steps forward. The orchestra sighs, and from that silence a voice, not merely a sound, but something divine and impossible, reaching for the furthest edge of human expression. In the age of virtuosity, the voice was everything. Audiences no longer came for myth or philosophy alone. They came to hear what had never been heard before. Composers stopped shaping opera around grand ideas. They began to shape it around the voice itself, around the singular magic that only a human breath could conjure. Venice had given opera a stage for the masses, but soon other cities rose to leave their own marks on the art, turning Italy into a garden of sound. Rome, with its papal authority and strict moral codes, took opera in a different direction. Public stages were heavily regulated, but creativity found new pathways. Operas here became more symbolic, more grandiose. Staging was lavish, filled with theatrical illusions that blurred the line between heaven and earth, gods dropping from clouds, golden altars rising from the stage. Women were often forbidden to perform, so the castrati took on both the roles of gods and mortals, weaving an otherworldly thread through every performance. In Rome, opera was a kind of sacred illusion, a theater of both devotion and grandeur. Naples, on the other hand, burned with a more restless fire. In the late 1600s, it became Europe's musical forge, where the raw heat of emotion was hammered into bright, impossible forms. The city's conservatories were legendary, training singers to dance along the razor's edge of technique and feeling. With the patronage of the Spanish Bourbon court, Naples became a cradle of opera seria, stories of gods and heroes, of sacrifice and virtue, sung in the glow of candlelight. But this wasn't just about rules and form. In Naples, music had to live. Composers like Alessandro Scarlatti wrote arias that demanded everything of the voice, breath that could hold a note past the limits of reason, ornamentation that turned each phrase into a shimmering river of sound. Naples turned opera into a proving ground, a place where singers became stars, their names carried by word of mouth and the hush of velvet curtains. From the smoky streets of Naples, opera's influence spread across Europe like a wildfire. By the dawn of the 18th century, Italy wasn't just the birthplace of opera, it was its beating heart. But opera was no longer content to remain a private jewel. It began to slip beyond Italy's borders, carried by singers and composers who became ambassadors of a new sound. In France, the grandeur of Versailles gave birth to tragédies lyriques, blending dance, chorus, and music into a spectacle that echoed the formality of French court life. Composers like Lully and Rameau borrowed from Italian traditions, but they reshaped them into something distinctly French music that was both elegant and dramatic, a mirror of the French soul. And yet, even in Paris, the allure of Italian brilliance never faded. Italian singers became the darlings of the French elite, their voices stirring something beyond language, a promise that beauty could transcend borders. In Germany, too, the seeds of a new tradition were planted. German courts imported Italian composers and even castrati, blending the weight of German polyphony with the shimmering drama of the South. A young George Friedrich Handel walked the streets of Florence and Rome, his ears drinking in the sounds of Italy. He carried those echoes back to Germany and then to England, where he would shape them into something new. By the early 1700s, London itself was captivated by this art form from afar. Italian opera took root in English soil, often with imported stars whose voices could shatter the stillness of a midnight sky. The aristocracy flocked to hear the castrati, voices that seemed to cure melancholy itself. Among them was the legendary Farinelli, a singer whose fame blurred the line between man and myth. They said he could heal a broken heart with a single note, that his song was both balm and fire. Opera had become Europe's elite art, an international language of beauty and power. Italian was the tongue of every aria, every whispered vow in the dark of the theater. To attend an opera was to be part of something grander than a single city, to be swept into a world where the human voice was both mask and mirror. Yet even as opera's grandeur spread, something began to shift. Local traditions began to blossom. National languages crept onto stages, once ruled only by Italian. And with them came a new vision for what opera could be. For decades, opera had belonged to the gods, to myth and marble. But by the mid-18th century, a new sound was stirring at the edge of the stage: laughter. Opera buffa was born in Naples, a genre that turned its back on solemnity in favor of something more human. These operas didn't sing of kings and heroes. They sang of bakers, maids, and the sly grin of a servant who knew more than his master. Gone were the endless da capo arias that soared into the heavens. In their place were quicksilver ensembles, voices tumbling over one another in comic confusion. The music sparkled, the rhythms quickened, and the orchestration danced with the bright spirit of improvisation. Opera buffa was not about gods, it was about the world outside the theater door. One of the earliest triumphs was Giovanni Battista Pergolesi's La Serva Padrona in 1733. Just 3 characters: a clever maid, her pompous master, and a silent servant. Yet in this small tale, audiences heard something new, a sly wit, a gentle mocking of class and pride. It became a sensation, performed from the salons of Paris to the coffee houses of Vienna. Opera buffa didn't just entertain. It reshaped the very bones of opera, opening a door to stories that were both humorous and achingly real. Even composers writing in the grander style of opera seria could not ignore its impact. Eventually, it would find its perfect champion in Mozart, who would blend its laughter with deep human insight in works like The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni. But it all began in Italy, with cunning maids, lovesick poets, and barbers who sang as if the whole world could hear them. Opera had found a new voice, not just the divine, but the delightfully earthly. By the close of the 18th century, opera had become one of Europe's most powerful art forms, a tapestry of voice, music, and spectacle woven together by generations of dreamers. From Florence to Venice, from Naples to Rome, Italy had not only birthed opera, it had nurtured it, shaped it, and carried its echoes into every corner of the continent. And as the 19th century loomed on the horizon, opera was poised for yet another transformation, a deeper plunge into emotional realism, nationalism, and the stormy depths of the human soul. Giants like Rossini, Donizetti, and later Verdi and Puccini would carry opera into new realms of passion and heartbreak, where music and drama were no longer separate threads but a single, searing flame. But that was still to come, a future built upon the echoes of laughter and longing that had begun in candlelit rooms and crowded city squares. Because opera was never just one story or one voice. It was and is a chain of voices, reaching back through time and forward into the hearts of those yet to come. If tonight's story of laughter and longing, of Naples' fiery stages, and the hushed salons of Europe has captured your heart, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe in the power of a single note, and let us know where you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, every echo carries a memory, and every memory begins with a song. Imagine a stage where gods could fall in love, where peasants could outwit kings, and where silence itself was transformed into soaring sound. This was the revelation of early Italian opera, that music could heighten language, that a single voice could carry not just melody, but the very soul of a character. In these first experiments, myth and comedy, love and grief, all took flight, and the audience was invited to feel deeply and vividly, sometimes unbearably. Italy gave the world more than a stage. It gave us the belief that art could echo the full range of human experience, from the divine to the delightfully ordinary. Even today, the fingerprints of those early operas remain. Modern theater, musical film, the shape of every aria, and every orchestral swell, all are haunted by those first echoes from Florence, Venice, and Naples. Listen closely, and you can still hear them. The passion of Monteverdi's arias, the mischievous laughter of opera buffa, the grand architecture of Venetian theaters that turned every performance into a world of its own. Opera, at its core, is a human invention, an attempt to give voice to what words alone cannot contain. And centuries ago, in Italy, it found that voice. From the whispered myths in Florence's candlelit salons, to the thunderous applause in Venice's grand halls, to the laughter that rang out in Naples' crowded theaters, opera was born not from perfection, but from passion. A curtain rose, and a world began to sing. As we shift from the flickering footlights of the opera stage to the bronze glow of the ancient world, the story of civilization takes us further back in time to an age that knew no stages, but built entire cities as if they were performances. In the centuries before 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was alive in ways the world had never seen before. This was the height of the Late Bronze Age, an era when empires rose like giants along river valleys and mountain slopes, and trade ships stitched them together like silver threads. To the west, the Mycenaeans ruled from stone fortresses that bristled with watchtowers and ambition. In the north, the Hittite Empire spread its dominion across the highlands of Anatolia, its capital Hattusa, a labyrinth of power and faith. Along the sun-baked shores of Canaan, bustling port cities thrived on trade, their streets alive with the chatter of merchants and the scent of foreign spices. And farther south, Egypt's new kingdom reigned, its pharaohs raising temples that touched the sky. East of all these, the Babylonians and Assyrians watched and waited, their eyes turned toward the shifting alliances that shaped this world. These were not isolated kingdoms. They spoke different tongues and bowed to different gods, but they were bound by the flow of goods and ideas. Ships from Cyprus carried copper. Caravans from Afghanistan brought tin, the two metals that, together, forged the very substance of the age, bronze. Luxury goods poured across these trade routes like rivers of wealth, ivory and lapis lazuli, gold and linen, perfumes and chariots. Grain fed the hungry cities. Scribes recorded every transaction on clay tablets that still speak across millennia. And kings? They wrote not only in threats, but in the language of diplomacy. In Akkadian, the shared tongue of courts, they called each other brother, their words laced with both affection and suspicion. It was, in many ways, the first global age. Power was not built by conquest alone, but by a delicate balance of trust, trade, and quiet alliances. Yet in such a complex web, even the slightest tear could ripple outward, unraveling everything. When one city faltered, another felt the tremor. When trade routes broke like snapped threads, cities starved. And when nature or war or the slow corrosion of ambition struck, the whole system cracked. Around 1200 BCE, those cracks became fractures, and then collapse. Within a generation, the lights of this interconnected world dimmed and vanished. Palaces fell silent, their frescoes crumbling in the dark. Writing systems disappeared. Populations shrank, leaving behind only the hushed memories of what had once been. Grain no longer flowed. Bronze was no longer forged. The very world that had seemed eternal with its kings and scribes, its gods and its gold, fell into a silence that still echoes today. In the rugged hills of mainland Greece, the Mycenaean palaces, once proud fortresses of power, began to crumble. The Mycenaeans, heirs to Minoan craft and masters of the Aegean, had built a network of city-states: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes. Each was ruled by a wanax, a warrior king, and sustained by armies of scribes, artisans, and soldiers. They were organized and literate, their records etched in the script of Linear B, lists of grain, chariot wheels, tribute paid in gold and blood. They raised walls that seemed to scrape the sky, cyclopean stones, stacked with a strength that would defy centuries of storms. But these walls could not protect them from the slow unraveling of the world. The collapse was not a single cataclysm, but a chorus of disasters. Invasions from the sea, earthquakes that cracked stone like pottery, famines that hollowed out cities from within. And always, behind these visible tremors, the quiet erosion of trade and trust, the slow realization that the system itself had grown too vast, too fragile to endure. In the end, the Mycenaean kingdoms fell into ruin. The scribes who once tallied the wealth of kings dropped their styluses. The warriors who guarded the gates laid down their spears. And the songs of those courts, if they were ever sung at all, were swallowed by silence. Yet even in this ruin, a seed was planted, because every end carries within it the echo of a new beginning. The collapse of the Bronze Age world did not erase its memory. It simply buried it, waiting for a later generation to uncover, to imagine, and to sing it back into life. And so, as we leave behind the echo of opera's first breath and step deeper into the ancient past, let us remember, every civilization is built on the dreams of those who dared to raise their voices. And every note, whether sung in a marble theater or scratched onto a clay tablet, is a promise that even silence can be broken. If tonight's tale of ancient empires and lost voices has stirred your sense of wonder, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe in the power of memory, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Because here at Stunning Story, every end is also a beginning, and every beginning carries the echo of those who came before. Imagine the quiet after the storm, a world once alive with trade, song, and kingship, now silent. Around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean world, so powerful, so carefully woven into the very fabric of the Aegean, began to unravel. First came fire. Palaces that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and rubble. Pylos burned to the ground. Mycenae itself was damaged twice, perhaps, and Tiryns and Thebes followed suit, their once proud walls blackened and hollow. The script of Linear B, the careful accounting of a civilization in clay, vanished without a final word. No more tablets, no more scribes. The bureaucracies that had counted grain and chariots collapsed into silence. What followed was not just a poetic darkness, it was literal. Towns shrank. Monumental architecture was abandoned. Trade routes that had once bound distant lands like threads of gold snapped and fell away. A dark age began, not just for a decade or a generation, but for centuries. Greece became a land of scattered villages, each clinging to what memory and myth remain. What caused it? There are theories many, but none complete. Some whisper of earthquakes, for the region lies along restless fault lines, and the ruins of Mycenaean cities bear scars of seismic fury. Others speak of rebellion of a lower class, long kept under the heel of the palace elite, finally rising. Still others point to famine, the slow, grinding cruelty of climate shifts that turned fertile fields to dust and sowed chaos in hearts and homes. And then there's the shadowy specter of the sea peoples, mysterious raiders, their names etched into Egyptian records like a warning. Did they come to the shores of Greece, sweeping away the palaces in a tide of violence? Or were they themselves the desperate exiles of a world already collapsing? The truth may lie in the weave of all these strands. The Mycenaean world was complex, and complexity, in the end, can be its own undoing. When systems are too tightly wound, a single break can echo through every stone and every life. And so this civilization, the world that gave birth to the tales of Agamemnon and Achilles, of Troy and heroes and gods, vanished, not with a final battle, but with a slow, grinding disintegration. Yet even as their palaces fell to ruin, their stories endured. They would echo in the poetry of Homer, in the marble of later centuries, in the very shape of the Western imagination. To the north of this crumbling world lay another empire, one that had once rivaled Egypt and defied the might of Assyria. The Hittites, masters of Anatolia, had built an empire of stone and law, centered on the formidable city of Hattusa. Here, kings governed through both sword and diplomacy, sending tablets etched in cuneiform across the known world. Here, they signed the world's first peace treaty, a fragile truce after the clash of Kadesh. Hattusa was a marvel, ringed with walls that defied siege, its libraries alive with the wisdom of 1,000 scribes. From here, orders went out to distant governors. Disputes were settled with the stroke of a stylus, and kings addressed pharaohs as equals. But around 1190 BCE, the messages stopped. The city was destroyed, its gates splintered, its temples silent. No final proclamation has survived, no record of the moment when everything fell. The Hittites vanished into the quiet, not with a thunderclap, but with a sigh. Why? The evidence is scattered, like the shards of a broken amphora. Some see invasions or migrations, waves of displaced peoples pushing in from the west, seeking new homes among the old. Others suspect that the seeds of collapse lay within, rival factions gnawing at the roots of power, civil discord weakening the heart of empire. Drought and famine may have followed, grinding down the strength of kings and the resolve of their subjects. When the capital fell, the empire's far-flung vassal states crumbled in turn. Egypt, for a time, weathered the storm, but the Hittites were not spared. Their world dissolved into a patchwork of small kingdoms, the Neo-Hittites, scattered like echoes of a vanished song across northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. The grandeur was gone. A kingdom that had once held its own against pharaohs and kings, that had harnessed the secrets of iron and diplomacy, was swallowed by the silence of time. For 3,000 years, the Hittites would be no more than a rumor, a name whispered in the dark until modern archaeology unearthed their broken gates and clay tablets, piecing together a story that still stirs both wonder and warning. In this fragile world of bronze and ambition, even the greatest walls could not keep out the night. Yet, of all the powers of the late Bronze Age, it was Egypt that stood longest and fell the hardest into memory. In the 13th century BCE, under pharaohs like Ramses II, Egypt was a world unto itself. Its temples rose like mountains of stone. Its armies held the line against the Hittites and turned back the desert tribes that hovered like shadows at the edges of empire. Its influence reached deep into Canaan and Syria, binding the lands of the Levant to the Nile in a dance of trade and tribute. In this golden age, pharaohs were more than kings, they were living gods. Their names were carved in stone and written in the winds of the desert. The grandeur of Karnak, the power of the new kingdom, all spoke of a civilization that had learned to bend time to its will. But even for Egypt, the night would come. The very networks that gave it strength, the trade routes, the vassal kingdoms, the endless flow of goods and grain, were the same threads that would begin to fray. The sea peoples, the climate's cruel turn, the slow grind of internal descent, each played its part. In the end, Egypt survived, but the world it ruled was forever changed. The collapse of these ancient powers was not a single catastrophe, but a slow, relentless unwinding. And in that silence in the centuries, When the script of Linear B was forgotten, and the kings of Hattusa were dust, the stage was set for the birth of new legends. For in every ruin lies a seed, and in every silence, a story waiting to be sung again. If tonight's journey into the twilight of the Bronze Age has sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who believe that every ruin has a voice, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, every echo is a promise that the past is never truly gone. It is only waiting to be heard. Imagine the Nile's gentle sway, the fertile banks alive with the hum of civilization, and then, suddenly, the hush of an empire holding its breath. In the twilight of the 13th century BCE, Egypt was still a kingdom of stone and ceremony, ruled by pharaohs who wore their power like a second skin. Under Ramses III, Egypt was strong, sophisticated, unshaken by the storms that rumbled through the lands of its neighbors. Vassal cities sent tribute in gold and grain, and the priests of Karnak raised prayers that echoed through ages. But just decades later, something was coming. Egypt's own records speak of it, in ominous fragments, the arrival of an enemy from the sea, a confederation of warriors known only as the Sea Peoples. They came like a storm, wielding weapons and fire, sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean with a ferocity that turned palaces to embers and kingdoms to dust. In his inscriptions at Medinet Habu, Ramses III left us a record of this moment carved in stone, defiant against the darkness. He named them the Peliset, the Shurden, the Luka, the Shekelesh. They came by land and sea, chariots rattling like thunder, ships that darkened the horizon. They had already destroyed Hatti, the empire of the Hittites. They had crushed cities in the Levant. Now they stood at the gates of Egypt itself. Ramses prepared. He fortified the delta, raised a navy, and met the invaders with every ounce of Egyptian might. The battle raged across the waters and the sand. Egypt won barely. The Sea Peoples were repelled. Their broken armies settled in Egypt's borderlands, some absorbed into its vast machinery of priests and laborers. But victory carried its own price. Egypt survived, but it was changed forever. After Ramses III, Egypt weakened rapidly. Central authority, once as unshakable as the pyramids, began to erode. Tombs were robbed echoes of a society that had lost its faith in eternity. Grain was scarce. In Deir el-Medina, the very builders of Pharaoh's tombs laid down their tools in the first labor strike recorded in human history. The age of empire had ended. Egypt withdrew into itself no longer the towering power of old, but a kingdom bracing for a long decline. Unlike Mycenae or Hattusa, Egypt left us its story in vivid lines and hieroglyphs. It remembered the Sea Peoples. It chronicled its own struggle. And though it did not vanish into silence, it was forever marked by the storm that had swept across the world. Among the most enduring mysteries of the Bronze Age collapse are the Sea Peoples themselves. They appear like phantoms in the records of Egypt, of Ugarit, of coastal kingdoms swallowed by the waves of history. They were not a single tribe or nation, but a confederation of warriors who moved by both land and sea, driven by something deeper than conquest. Who were they? The names echo across time: Peliset, Shurden, Shekelesh, Denyen, Jeker. Some scholars believe they came from Anatolia or the Aegean, displaced by famine or war. Others see them as warriors who had once fought for the very kingdoms they now brought low mercenaries turned against their masters. They appear in the last desperate letters of Ugarit, a city in modern-day Syria that was once a jewel of trade and culture. These final clay tablets urgent, pleading tell of a city under siege, of help that would never come. When the Sea Peoples arrived, Ugarit burned. Its archives, thousands of years of memory, were buried in a single night of fire. The Sea Peoples moved with a terrible purpose. They fought with chariots and ships, wielding the skills of empires against those who had grown complacent in their power. Egypt's triumph over them was the last act of an age already cracking at the seams. For in many places, they did not simply conquer, they settled. The Peliset mentioned in Egyptian records are widely believed to be the Philistines, the same fierce enemies who would haunt the pages of biblical texts forever at odds with the Israelites in Canaan. Were the sea peoples invaders, or were they refugees driven by desperation, hunger, and the slow failure of a world that could no longer feed them? Perhaps they were both a symptom of collapse as much as its cause, because when the granaries emptied and the rains failed, the lines between survivor and conqueror blurred into blood and ash. The sea peoples remain, in many ways, nameless, but their legacy is undeniable. They were the face of chaos, the final blow to a system already unsteady. They were the signal that the old world was dying, and that something new, though yet unformed, would rise in its place. Yet not all of this ruin was driven by the clash of swords and chariots. Beneath the visible scars of war lay a quieter, more patient destroyer: climate. In recent decades, scientists and archaeologists have begun to piece together a haunting pattern. Pollen samples pulled from lake beds, sediment cores drawn from the depths of the Mediterranean, abandoned fields that once fed empires, all tell the same story. Beginning around 1200 BCE, the rains that had fed the kingdoms of the East began to falter. Crops withered in the fields. The sun scorched the earth. Drought crept in, silent and remorseless. Rivers shrank, and the harvests failed. In the halls of kings, the granaries emptied, and in the hearts of the people, the spark of revolt was lit. As the climate shifted, the carefully balanced world of the Bronze Age, its trade routes, its alliances, its thousand promises of security began to buckle. Starving peasants became soldiers. Farmers became raiders. And in that churning tide of desperation, the sea peoples found their strength. Egypt alone survived the storm, but even Egypt was changed. The records of Medinet Habu stand as both triumph and warning, that even the greatest walls and deepest rivers cannot turn back the wind when the world itself begins to change. And so, in the twilight of an age, the sea peoples sailed into legend. They were both the harbingers and the harvesters of an ending, their names etched in the margins of history, their presence felt in every ruin and every silence that followed. If tonight's story of collapse and survival, of warriors and wanderers, has stirred your thoughts, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe that the past is never truly gone, and tell us where you're listening from. Because here, at Stunning Story, every wave in history carries a story, and every story is a breath waiting to be heard. Imagine rain, once a gentle promise from the sky, a steady rhythm that fed fields and cities alike. And then, imagine that promise breaking. Around 1200 BCE, the skies turned silent. Rainfall declined sharply, and with it, the harvests failed. For civilizations built on the bedrock of grain, this was a disaster beyond reckoning. Grain wasn't just food, it was the heartbeat of the Bronze Age world, the currency of empires and the promise of tomorrow. When the fields went barren, cities starved, granaries emptied, and economies that had once thrived on trade and tribute began to crumble. The web of interdependence, the trade routes that carried copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, and stories from every shore now became chains, each link straining under the weight of scarcity. Letters unearthed from the ruins of Ugarit speak of this desperation. Grain shipments delayed, contracts broken, voices pleading for bread and hope. The Hittite kings, once so certain of their power, sent urgent appeals for food written in the same tablets that had once boasted of victory and tribute. Even in Egypt, where the Nile's annual floods had always been the steady pulse of the kingdom, signs of strain began to show. Ramses III, who had faced the fury of the sea peoples, now faced another foe: hunger. He was forced to allocate grain for refugees and workers, stretching the empire's resources to the breaking point. In times of plenty, these intricate systems, the palaces, the scribes, the armies, worked in perfect harmony. But in scarcity, they faltered. Famine was not just hunger, it was panic. Trade routes, once alive with goods, fell silent as regions hoarded what little they had left. People fled the cities for the countryside, seeking soil still damp with promise. Some turned to raiding, to survival by blade. Others packed what they could carry and joined the long lines of migration, drifting across a world that was no longer theirs. In that vacuum, order itself began to fade. The cities of the Bronze Age were wonders of complexity, but they were built on fragile foundations. They were machines of stone and clay dependent on bureaucracies, on scribes who counted every grain, on armies who enforced the king's word. When a single palace fell, the gears of that machine ground to a halt. These kingdoms had no written constitutions, no parchment-bound laws to outlast the king's voice. Their authority lived in tradition and in the promise of the god's favor. When the rains failed and the granaries emptied, that promise was broken. The power that had once seemed eternal was revealed as mortal. Climate, then, was not the sole cause of the collapse, but it was the spark that turned weakness to ruin. When the rains stopped, the world began to fall apart. And with it, the very memory of that world began to fade. In the palaces of the Bronze Age, writing was power. It was how kings commanded, how priests kept the favor of the gods, how merchants counted their copper and scribes wrote their taxes into eternity. From the cuneiform tablets of the Hittites to the linear B records of Mycenaean Greece, writing was the thread that bound civilization together. But as the palaces fell to flame and ruin, those threads were cut. Around 1200 BCE, entire writing systems disappeared as if they had never been. In Greece, linear B, the script that had once kept track of every jar of oil, every chariot wheel, was lost. The knowledge of how to read it vanished into the long silence. In Ugarit, the elegant alphabetic script that had carried the dreams of traders and kings fell silent after the city burned. In Anatolia, the Hittite scribes who had once etched the laws of empires left behind only unfinished tablets, their last lines trailing off into dust. The silence was not just political, it was literal. Without writing, a kingdom's memory vanished. Taxes could not be collected. Laws could not be preserved. What had been a world of written record and measured power now became a landscape of whispers. The collapse of writing was not an intentional erasure, but a byproduct of survival. Scribes need palaces, and palaces need surplus. When both were gone, what remained was memory carried by the breath, the songs of poets, and the stories told by flickering firelight. For centuries, the tales of gods and kings would live not in clay or stone, but in voices, passed from one generation to the next. And so, from the ruins of Mycenaean Greece, a new kind of memory was born. In the long, dark centuries that followed, the names of Achilles, Odysseus, and Agamemnon would echo through the land, not written by historians, but woven by poets into the great epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey. These songs carried the fading echoes of a world whose records had turned to rubble, a world whose last cries of desperation were buried in tablets no one could read. The dark age that followed was not merely a loss of light, but a loss of language. Knowledge did not vanish in a blaze of fire, but in the quiet absence of scribes. Without the surplus of grain to sustain them, the archivists laid down their styluses. Without the palaces to command them, the libraries turned to dust. And yet from that silence, new voices would rise. Because in every ruin lies a seed of something that endures, something that memory alone cannot kill. In the centuries to come, new kingdoms would rise from the broken stones, and new songs would find their way into the world. But the silence of the Bronze Age would remain a ghost, haunting the edges of every story. If tonight's glimpse into the fall of empires and the loss of memory has sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe that every ruin has a voice, and tell us where you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, every echo is a promise, and every promise is a thread waiting to be woven once more. Imagine a world where every order, every trade, every prayer was once etched in clay or written on fragile sheets of papyrus, and then, suddenly, all that ink went dry. In the twilight of the Bronze Age, as palaces crumbled and empires withered, something more profound vanished alongside them, writing itself. This was not just a political collapse, it was a cultural one. A civilization that had once woven its story across thousands of miles had forgotten how to write it down. The world of scribes and styluses, of kings commanding through tablets and priests recording the favors of the gods, fell silent. It would take centuries for writing to return to Greece. Centuries before new scripts would be born, long after the Bronze Age itself had vanished, buried beneath layers of ash, myth, and the relentless tide of time. One of the most haunting legacies of the Bronze Age collapse is this: the disappearance of writing. Civilizations that had once chronicled every shipment of grain, every treaty sealed by the hands of kings, every plea to the divine, fell into a silence so complete that even their memories began to fade. In the centuries before the collapse, writing had been the lifeblood of empires. The Hittites had used cuneiform to knit their realm together, dispatching orders across Anatolia. Ugarit had crafted its own alphabetic script, an innovation that spoke of a world on the edge of literacy's future. Mycenaean Greece had Linear B, a language of accounting and power, its scribes carefully tracking every amphora and every blade of bronze. Egypt, of course, carved its history in stone, but also wrote on papyrus the whispers of pharaohs and the balance sheets of grain. But when the palaces burned, the scribes had nowhere to write. Linear B vanished alongside Mycenaean kings, never to be written in Greece for hundreds of years. Cuneiform, once the language of diplomacy across the Near East, fell silent beyond Assyria and Babylon. Ugaritic, that elegant script born in a coastal city that traded in cedar and gold, died with the last embers of its harbor. Even in Egypt, where literacy had once been the birthright of every temple and the duty of every priest, it began to fade as central authority eroded. The quiet that followed was not just political, it was a loss of memory itself. Writing was how the Bronze Age world remembered who it was, its laws, its rituals, its lineage, the promises of kings, and the curses of the gods. Without writing, history became a song half forgotten, a story told by the light of a dying fire. In Greece, that silence was filled not by new tablets, but by voices. The names of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus did not endure on clay, they survived in the breath of poets and the songs of bards. For generations, these stories were carried by memory alone, shaped and reshaped with every telling, until centuries later, they would find new life in ink and verse in the epics of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. The collapse of writing was more than just the loss of words, it was the collapse of order. Without records, taxes could not be collected. Armies went unpaid, supply lines frayed. Temples that had once measured each offering and ritual with scrupulous care fell into improvisation or oblivion. In this vacuum, new voices had to rise, and they did, slowly, like seeds pushing through the ash. What replaced writing in those long centuries was not new scripts, but silence and, eventually, reinvention. Out of the darkness of the collapse, new scripts would emerge. New languages, new mythologies, new kingdoms would rise to fill the void. The bridge between the glittering halls of the late Bronze Age and the marble temples of the classical world would be built not by scribes, but by memory, a memory reconstructed piece by piece, generation by generation. The voices of the Bronze Age had once filled libraries, palaces, and marketplaces. Now they are echoes, fragments pressed into clay, buried and forgotten until archaeologists, thousands of years later, would brush the dust away and hear them once more. When the dust of the Bronze Age collapse finally settled, the old world was gone. Mycenae, Hattusa, Ugarit, their walls lay in ruins. Trade routes that had once glistened with gold and ivory fell silent. Palaces that had commanded the fates of thousands stood empty, their great halls filled only with the sigh of the wind. Writing itself, the breath of civilization, was gone. Population shrank. Cities turned to memories. But in that darkness, something new began to stir. The centuries that followed from around 1100 to 800 BCE are often called the Greek Dark Age, but that name belies the quiet resilience that bloomed in the shadows. Yes, there were fewer cities and fewer luxuries. The great halls of Mycenae were replaced by small villages clinging to life in the rocky hills. But even here, people adapted. They built smaller, tighter communities, places where survival was measured in barley and memory, not gold. Iron became the promise of a new age, It was harder to smelt, but once mastered, it offered a strength that bronze could not. Slowly, the Iron Age dawned not with grand pronouncements, but with quiet perseverance. In Greece, the survivors of the Mycenaean collapse became the ancestors of something greater. The oral traditions that carried fragments of the past found new life in the verses of poets. Generations of bards turned the broken memories of heroes into songs that would outlast kingdoms. Elsewhere, new powers emerged from the ashes of old. In the Levant, the Phoenicians, heirs of the Canaanite cities, revived trade across the seas, weaving a net of commerce that spanned the Mediterranean. They brought with them a new alphabet, simpler, more flexible, easier to learn than the scripts of the past. It was a seed of literacy's rebirth, carried in the holds of ships and the hands of merchants. To the east, Assyria and Babylon rose again, empires rebuilt on lessons learned from the chaos, each kingdom a testament to the enduring power of ambition and memory. Even Egypt, battered but unbowed, found new ways to survive in a world that had learned how fragile even the mightiest could be. If tonight's journey through the silent halls of the past and the quiet dawn of the Iron Age has captured your imagination, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who still believe that even in silence, there are stories waiting to be told. And let us know where you're listening from, because here at Stunning Story, every ruin is a promise, and every promise is a voice waiting to be heard. And yet, even as the echoes of that collapse still rang through the hills and valleys, one kingdom, battered and diminished, continued to stand as a cultural beacon. Egypt, though weakened, preserved its ancient traditions and memory. Its priests still murmured the old prayers, and its scribes still traced the names of gods in careful lines of ink. It was no longer the towering power it had once been, but it remained a fragment of the old world, navigating the uncertainties of a changed age. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not an end. It was a reset, a turning of the soil that cleared away the towering systems of kings and chariots, palaces and scribes. In the spaces left behind, something new took root. Smaller kingdoms emerged, local chieftains carving out realms in the cracks of fallen empires. Languages shifted, customs evolved, and power became more diffuse. What had once been an interlocking web of palaces and ports became a tapestry of villages, hill forts, and harbor towns, each adapting, each finding new ways to survive. The world was more fragmented now, but also more flexible. In the wake of that great unraveling, innovation was born of necessity. Communities learned to live on the land's terms, no longer bound to the elaborate trade routes that had once linked them to distant pharaohs and foreign kings. The Phoenicians sailed their cedar ships deeper into the Mediterranean, reviving trade on their own terms. Iron replaced bronze, a symbol of change, harder to forge but stronger once mastered. And in that new age of iron and memory, the seeds of the future were sown. The myths of the Bronze Age, of heroes and monsters, of gods who shaped the wind, did not vanish in the silence. They lingered, like seeds buried beneath the rubble. In the centuries to come, those myths would bloom again. They would become the tales that poets carried on their lips and sculptors carved into marble, the threads of memory that tied the broken past to the living present. The collapse of the Bronze Age reminds us of a simple, sobering truth, that no civilization, however mighty, is immune to change. Empires may rise on the strength of armies and the wisdom of kings, but they can falter when the rain no longer falls, or when the harvest fails. They can crumble when the weight of their own ambition grows too heavy to bear. Yet, from collapse can come renewal. In the silence that followed the fall of palaces and the fading of scribes' voices, a new story began. A story of survival, of adaptation, of people who would take the broken pieces of the old world and build something new. In that quiet dawn, the first glimmers of the classical world shone like distant stars. If tonight's journey through the echoes of collapse and the promise of rebirth has touched your curiosity, don't forget to like this video. Share it with those who find hope in the cycle of rise and fall. And tell us where you're listening from. Because here at Stunning Story, every ruin is not just an ending, it is the soil from which new dreams are born.